Comments on the article Mathematical Foundations of Direct Democracy. Citizens constantly come who really want to enlighten me about how there is in probability theory and in math. Modeling is all arranged. In what they enlighten mainly on the basis of their, let's say, everyday ideas about the concepts of random events, related events, and so on, and so on. And there are a lot of versions issued. Either if the events of the report depend, then it can no longer be considered random, or if two events depend on each other, then they do not have any probability there, or they are present, but some kind is not what I think. In general, a whole bunch of interesting hypotheses. It must be said here that probability theory is not a very intuitive thing at all, and in some cases, even counterintuitive. However, if you work hard, you can still understand the logic of all these constructions. And today, even with some concepts, we will do this. But nevertheless, intuitively it seems to a person that he has some understanding of the everyday meaning of a certain word. And in the scientific method, in the theory of probability, it is understood exactly in the same way. And the most obvious example of this is actually the very concept of randomness. It often seems to people that randomness is something that happens by itself, whether there is something in nature that causes these random events. And if someone thought about it or tried to adjust something, then this event is necessarily not accidental. Whether it is only in certain places that you can search for these random events. Well, let's say it works with a coin, but, well, it doesn't work with voting. Well, actually, that's what randomness is. Suppose we gave people cards, and here the cards are in front of them, they haven't opened them yet. And the person is trying to imagine, but what kind of cards he may have on his hands. Note that the cards have already been dealt, that is, each of the cards that lies in front of him cannot change. When he opens it, it will be the same card that was lying in front of him. It's just that he didn't know her before, and after that he recognized her. And that's the same thing at first he did not know, and makes the situation completely analogous to the fact that he would not have been dealt a card, but simply he would have pulled it out of the deck and immediately looked at what was so. He had no idea what kind of card it was. And based on this rather simple representation, in fact, the theory of probability and the concept of a random event is born. In other words, a random event is some kind of event, that is, something that we can distinguish, something like an act. Here it began, and here it ended. We can single out for her something like outcomes, well, that is, variants of how it ended. And finally, an important point, we do not know what the exact outcome will be. In the generalized case, in fact, we could consider even the event for which the outcome is known in advance, or there is only one event at all, to be random. But this is purely for generality, and it is clear that for practical reasons, events are usually considered that have more than one outcome, and it is not known in advance exactly what the outcome will be. At the same time, if we can make any assumptions about how often this or that outcome will occur, the event does not cease to be random. Randomness is, in fact, our inability to predict what will happen. That is, the probability theory itself, and all its terms, they are not really about any natural phenomena. They are not about the relationship of our knowledge with something else. Well, with phenomena, for example, physical or logical, it doesn't matter. The main thing is that we can't say for sure in advance, but what will happen there. And actually, the concept and probability introduced on this occasion, too, if you look at it a little more closely, is quite intuitive. Suppose we flip a coin. We cannot predict the outcome, that is, this event is really random. But we count the number of throws, and at the same time calculate how many times tails fell out, and how many times heads. Now, if we stop throwing at some point, and divide the number of times tails fell, by the number of times we flipped a coin at all, we will get purity. Literally, a kind of indicator of how often this phenomenon occurs. This indicator cannot be less than 0, well, because tails cannot fall out less than 0 times. And there can't be more than 1, because it can't fall out more times than we threw a coin at all. And accordingly, the concept of probability is our best, based on our knowledge, assumption about the frequency with which this phenomenon will occur. In other words, note that cleanliness is something that we have physically observed, and probability is our assumption about what we observe. Well, with a certain system of prerequisites, we can really build such assumptions. However, we can build them on the basis of an experiment too. That is, we took a coin, left it many, many times, for example, 100,000 times, counted how many times tails fell out, and got that, well, in about 1 or 2 cases, tails just falls out. I note that approximately we are unlikely to get exactly 1 second. But at the same time, increasing the number of experiments, we will notice that this very purity, observed on a long series, is getting closer and closer to 1 second. In other words, 1 second is a very good assumption that we will observe if we flip a coin infinitely many times, which technically we cannot do, of course, but we can imagine such a situation and calculate a certain limit. In other words, these considerations are about the fact that if there is some kind of regularity behind an event, then it can no longer be considered accidental. It is not consistent in this sense. There is some kind of pattern, and we don't know it. We can get an estimate of purity on an experiment, and that's what it will be, a probability. If we know something about the regularity, we can refine our assumption of probability and test everything again on the experiment, that is, whether we assumed correctly. Moreover, depending on what knowledge we have and what knowledge we will have in the future, we can better and better approximate the very frequency that will be observed in the future. That is, to assume its probability, specifying this very numerical estimate on the basis of our knowledge. At the same time, it is wrong to assume that these are the probabilities that we assumed earlier. They were somehow wrong. No, they were correct, because they were built on the basis of the knowledge that we had then. Adding knowledge may well adjust our estimates. Well, the same thing if you are asked now, where is your friend who usually lives in Moscow? Well, you say, well, probably somewhere in Moscow, if it's some arbitrary time of day. If it's night, you probably assume that he is most likely in his apartment, yes, and say, well, somewhere in his apartment. What is the probability that he is in his apartment? Well, estimate how often he goes out at night at all. Well, you say, well, I don't know there, 99/100ths. Here, 3 times a year, he spends the night somewhere else, the other times there. In other words, notice, the knowledge of what time of day it is has been added. We added to it the knowledge we already had, the behavior of our friend, and made an assessment. And at any time of the day, the fact that he is at home, in his apartment, it is, of course, much less likely. And it's much more likely that he's somewhere else. In other words, the search range increases, and the probability of staying at the endpoint decreases. I would like to emphasize once again that probability is about our assumptions based on our knowledge of the phenomenon. This is not something that exists in nature, and not something that is connected with events that do not depend on anything. No, that's our assumption. Why is it being introduced? Well, first of all, of course, it was introduced in order to evaluate certain strategies in gambling. That is, for example, thanks to this concept, it is possible to predict to some extent how much we will win if we play a game with the rules we know. The game, apparently, includes random events, that is, having an element of unpredictability, which, however, is suitable for almost any game, because in most cases, even if the situation is fully known to us at any given time, we do not know who will win and who will lose. Actually, statistical and probabilistic analysis is exactly that. These are attempts to evaluate our winnings, or our damage, on some long series of, let's say, games. In general events, from these same intuitive assumptions, one can draw the first conclusion about probabilities in general. We are already learning that, since the act is defined, that is, the beginning and the end of the event, it will necessarily end with some outcome. That is, the probability that there will be some outcome, from the full set of possible ones, is equal to 1. Since we said that the event ends with something, every time we observe something. And thus, the probability that at least some outcome has occurred is equal to 1. If these outcomes are mutually exclusive, we can make a more accurate judgment about the ratio of their probability. Since no two of them can occur at the same time, and the probability that at least one of them will occur is equal to 1, this means that the sum of the probabilities of all outcomes is also equal to 1. Hereafter, with a small letter p, I will denote an abstract probability, that is, something that is used for the general case of reasoning. And with a capital letter P, I will denote a specific probability, chosen for an example, in some phenomenon there. Well, keep in mind, one more addition, sometimes there will be square brackets in addition to round brackets, so this is the same thing. Simply, since all this is done by Wolfram mathematics, square brackets appear in the program part, and round brackets appear in the fact that mathematics is output, and as a calculation of a particular code. So, from the fact that the sum of the probability of mutually exclusive events is equal to 1, for a simpler case involving only two outcomes, we can conclude that the sum of the probability of these two outcomes is equal to 1. If we conditionally designate one of the outcomes as outcome A, and the second outcome will be designated, for example, not, then we can say that the sum of the probabilities of A and not is equal to 1. Well, from this, accordingly, it is easy to find the probability that there will be an outcome not, provided that we know the probability of outcome A. In other words, note that all of these formulas that we used in this rather simple reasoning, they are not God's data. They follow from a fairly simple logical analysis of what we actually observe. Now the slightly more difficult part. We have, let's say, two events, and each of them has two outcomes. For one event, the outcome we are interested in, we will call A, and for the second event, the outcome we are interested in, we will call B. What is the probability that outcomes A and B occurred at the same time, and not some other pair? Here we can argue as follows. To begin with, let's abstract from what resolved the second event there. Just imagine that only the first one happens. And we know the probability that this event will end with the outcome A. From the full set, we will isolate all these times. Their share in a large number of trials will be equal to the probability of outcome A. Each of them will be docked the outcome of the second event. And the proportion of outcomes B in a large series of tests is exactly equal to the probability of PB. That is, we took a share of P and extracted from it a share equal to PB. In order to understand the share of the entire totality of such a composite event that both A and B have occurred, there, respectively, these two shares simply need to be multiplied. From there, such a classical ratio for the probability of a composite outcome is born. It is equal to just the product of probabilities. If we start testing this case experimentally, it will be confirmed. Sometimes. And sometimes it won't be confirmed. And here the question arises. It seems that everything was fine in the reasoning, but how could this happen? Well, of course, since we are dealing with some kind of randomness, we will never get exactly the ratio that we predicted. It is true only on an infinitely long series of tests. However, the deviations will be very high in some cases, and in some cases, we will almost exactly get this very product. Maybe it somehow coincidentally matches. We just guess, we have a chance to guess, and sometimes we guess, and sometimes we don't guess. However, we repeat the experiment with the same pair of phenomena, and are surprised to find that no matter how many times we make these observations, it comes true every time. On the other hand, for some other pair of phenomena, this does not come true every time. Actually, here we come across another interesting pattern, which, in fact, prompts us to introduce the concept of dependent events. Some outcomes may occur simultaneously, much more often than individually. And we know quite a lot of such phenomena. For example, we will take a stopwatch, on which we will measure exactly a minute. And all this minute, we will be looking at Vasily Pupkin. He opened the umbrella for that minute, or did not open it. Let's repeat this entertaining experiment many times and get some statistics, with which we extract the observed frequency of opening an umbrella by Vasily Pupkin for randomly selected minutes. That's what's interesting. If we conduct this interesting experiment at some random moments of time, then we will get one statistic. If we do this strictly during the rain, then the statistics will be different. It is clear that we can do exactly the same thing with rain too. That is, turn on the stopwatch and see if it rained or not during this minute. Also, collect a lot of statistics and use it to estimate the probability that it will rain at any minute. However, even for everyday reasons, it is quite understandable that if we do this on the street, then the probability that our friend Vasily Pupkin will open an umbrella during the rain is much higher than at any given time. Perhaps he opens this umbrella without rain, but with rain, most likely he opens it much more often. And here, if we multiply our estimate of the probability of rain by the probability of Vasily Pupkin opening an umbrella at any given time, we just get a discrepancy. These events are not independent, and therefore, the cumulative probability of some of their outcomes, it is not equal to the product of the probability of these outcomes separately. By the way, this is exactly what some experts in probability theory generally propose to consider as a criterion for the connectedness of events. That is, not to define it in some philosophical way, but simply to test it on an experiment. If the ratio about the product of probabilities has not been cynically fulfilled, then the events are related, and if they have been fulfilled, then they are independent. However, no matter how we define them, in any case, let's see what we can do about it at all. Can we deduce from the same logical considerations any relations linking probabilities to each other? There's another caveat about the designation system. There's some kind of trapezoid drawn here. In fact, this is the designation of conditional probability. That is, there is a probability that there will be an outcome B, provided that outcome A has already occurred. That is, for example, the probability that our friend will open the zones, provided that we know that it is already raining. In the literature, it is usually denoted simply by a vertical dash, but the Wolfram vertical dash is already occupied by the logical or operator, so for conditional probability they use this icon here. In general, in the future, it means exactly the same thing that is indicated in the books by a vertical dash. So, we have a probability of the occurrence of outcome B, provided that outcome A has already occurred, and naturally, there is probably some probability that outcome B will be, despite the fact that outcome A has not occurred, but has come, well, the second of the possible ones. Well, or just some other in general case. Well, anyway, what is the probability that both of them will come? Here, the ratio will already be completely accurate, and it will always be performed simply by construction. In total, the proportion of cases when the outcome A has occurred is equal to NA, and within them, there is a perfectly definite proportion of the fact that the outcome B has occurred. Note that it is written here B, provided that A. In other words, this is exactly the same proportion of outcomes B among those cases when exactly occurred. Accordingly, the formula for the simultaneous occurrence of outcomes is like this, and it will always be carried out experimentally. And it doesn't matter if these events are related or unrelated. Here is this probability. In the case when the events are independent, it is simply equal to the probability of PB. Therefore, in any case, this relation will be fulfilled. And in the case of independent events, we get the formula that we saw before, N auto, multiplied by NB. We can calculate the same for the case when there was an outcome B, but there was no outcome A. According to the same logic, we multiply the proportion of those cases when the outcome of no A occurred. By the proportion of cases when B occurred, we get the proportion of cases among the total number of cases. That is, the very purity we estimated. That is, the probability. Further, I will not repeat this whole long chain of spells, just mentally substitute it, and I will shorten it. And here is our criterion for evaluating the independence of events. If we have the product of probabilities A and B equal to the product of probability A by the conditional probability B, provided that it has occurred, then the events are independent. If this is not done, the events are dependent. The right part will always be executed, the left part will be executed only for independent events. However, there is an important point here. Despite the fact that events are dependent, despite the fact that we have a certain probability of occurrence of B, provided that outcome A has occurred, and there is certainly a probability of occurrence of B, provided that outcome A has not occurred. This does not mean at all that the probability of B is not real. We can do all the same things that we did before, that is, calculate how often event B occurred, ignoring the occurrence of event A, that is, not paying attention to whether it occurred or not, and this will be our estimate of the observed frequency, that is, the probability. These two probabilities are not mutually exclusive. Moreover, they are connected to each other, and we will see how exactly later. Therefore, the reasoning of this type is that, they say, if the events are dependent, then we can no longer take the probability separately. It is incorrect. We can always take this probability separately. Just a Saber condition, that's the very thing, in this case will not be fulfilled. And the probability itself is there, it is computable. Moreover, it can be calculated if we know the conditional probability, and vice versa. And this is done elementary. We have only two cases. A has come, and A has not come. Well, accordingly, we multiply the probability that A did not come by the probability that B came anyway, and add to it the probability that A came multiplied by the probability that B came at the same time. That is, we went through all possible options. The outcomes are mutually exclusive, so we can just sum them up. And that's how probability B is related to conditional probabilities B. That is, this value is not just defined, it is still computable and even meaningful. If we try to experiment to see if we have calculated it correctly, it turns out that it is correct, and we will really do it a little later. It follows from the above reasoning that we can experimentally distinguish dependent events from independent ones. Use that very criterion. However, the question arises, and what data do we need to have in order to detect this difference after all? Let's recall the previously voiced criterion. If the probability of simultaneous occurrence of outcomes is not equal to the product of the probability of these outcomes separately, then it follows that these events are dependent. There is no other way to distinguish dependent events from independent ones. In other words, in order to really experimentally find out if there is a dependence, we need to know all three numbers. In other words, we must, by conducting a series of experiments, calculate how often both initially occurred at the same time, and how often outcome occurred, and how often outcome B occurred. For example, we know P and P and B at the same time. Naturally, dividing this by this, we can calculate this, that is, PB. But we have no way of saying, but what we got as a result of the division is the probability of the occurrence of B at all, or is it the probability of the occurrence of B only if A has occurred? The same data was not reported to us, statistics are hidden from us, that's it. We can't distinguish one case from another. We will get the full statistics, we will see a fairly large discrepancy in this pattern, then we will say, yes, indeed, apparently, the events depend on each other. But not only that, let's ask ourselves one more question. Well, we have observed that the same inequality does not hold. And is this as a result of the fact that the first outcome causes the second outcome, or conversely, as a result of the fact that the second outcome causes the first outcome? Who's actually calling who there? Can we calculate this somehow? Purely symmetry considerations work here. The probability of simultaneous occurrence of events is the probability of A multiplied by the probability of B, provided A. However, with the same success, it should be equal to probability B multiplied by probability A, provided B. Here, purely for logical reasons, this follows. A and B are just what we called them. In fact, we could call them the other way around, and get exactly the same expression where they are rearranged. In other words, one is guaranteed to be equal to the other. This is clearly the same probability in these expressions. In other words, it is the same value. It is even written in the same way. That is, this is equal to this. We can write it out as a kind of equation, and this ratio will always be fulfilled. As you can see, it is remarkably symmetrical. In other words, we cannot say from any experimental data of this kind, or from any estimates of purity, which event was the cause and which was the consequence. We can establish this, but by other experiments, which are set according to completely different rules. If we only have pairwise values available to us, which was at each test, we cannot say what causes what. But on the other hand, from this expression, we can find any one of the four quantities, knowing the other three. For example, if we know PB, PA, and PE under condition B, we can calculate from this the probability of the occurrence of outcome B, provided that outcome A has occurred. They call this kind of expression the Bayes theorem, but it doesn't matter in this case. For us, this very conclusion is still important. Despite the fact that dependent outcomes, having complete statistics, we can distinguish from independent ones, and we can't find out what the cause is, what the effect is. And this, by the way, we will also see in the future, including on the experiment. Now, finally, let's take a look at a concrete example. This was all told not only for general education, but also to discuss the notorious model of direct democracy and its comparison with the dictator's decision-making. Suppose we have two people, each of whom can vote yes or no for some decision. And we know that the probability that A will vote yes is 0.7. We will designate this outcome as A, which will read as A voted yes. There is a person B who is an imitator of person, and he, therefore, spies on how A voted and repeats with a probability of 0.8 the same thing that A did. That is, the probability that B will vote yes, provided that A voted yes, is 0.8.
Вероятность того, что Б проголосует «да» при условии, что А проголосовал «да», 0,8.
The probability that he will vote no, provided that A voted no, is also 0.8. Well, such a symmetrical copycat. What else can we say about probabilities? Well, first of all, we can remember what is the probability that A will vote no. Well, 1 minus on, respectively, 0, as much as 3/10. The probability of voting no, provided that A voted yes is equal to 1, minus the probability of voting yes. In our case, we subtract 0 as many as 8/10 from 1, we get 0 as many as 2/10. That's how often B will vote no when A voted yes. If these formulas may not have seemed intuitive at first, in this case, they seem to be already becoming self-evident. We use only 3 ratios, somewhere like that. And through these 3 ratios, we deduce almost all the others. In the future, interestingly, everything will be almost the same. There will be more complex formulas, yes, but they too, in turn, although I will not demonstrate this, are derived from simpler ones. From this very, very small set. Let's ask ourselves the following question. Well, what is the probability that B will choose option yes if A chose option no? Well, actually, the ratio is exactly the same. We are asked what is the probability that B will choose option no, provided that A chose option no. We will subtract this case from 1, we will get the value we are interested in. And naturally, these two probabilities will be equal simply for reasons of symmetry. Well, we can continue in the same spirit. What is the probability that they both chose the yes option? Well, the probability of A is multiplied by the probability of B, provided that you chose the option yes. 0 as many as 56/100th pure multiplication of numbers. What is the probability that, in general, B chooses the option yes? Well, as if in all the many cases. We deduced this formula a little earlier, we substitute the current numbers into it, we get 0 as many as 62/100ths. What is the probability that, in general, B will choose the option no, in the entire set of cases.
На всем множестве случаев.
Well,
Ну,
we write a
если
symmetric
периодическую
formula,
формулу
substitute
подставляем
numbers
в
into it,
числа,
and we get
получаем
0
данные
as many as 38
probabilistic
hundredths. We can
Можем
even
даже
make sure
удостоверить,
that
что
these
вот эти
probabilities of two
вероятности
mutually
выражения
exclusive
чисел
outcomes
исхода
are really
действительно
equal to
равны
1.
единице.
Yes,
Да,
if
если
we
мы
add them up,
сложим,
we
мы
get exactly
получим
1.
ровно 1. Тем
Nevertheless,
не менее,
as it
как было
was said
сказано
before,
раньше, даже если
even
мы
if we
всей
have all
этой
this information,
информацией
we still
обладаем, мы
cannot
все
say
равно не
whether the
можем
first
сказать,
outcome is caused by the
первый
second
исход
or vice
вызывает
versa,
вторым,
the
или
second is the
наоборот,
first.
второй первым.
Let's use the
Воспользуемся
previously
ранее
deduced
выявленной
pattern.
закономерностью,
Let's solve this
разрешим
equation with respect to
уравнение
NA,
относительно
provided that we
P
substitute the
при
numbers
условии,
we have
что
there,
B,
and find the
подставим
probability that A voted
числа,
yes,
которыми мы
provided that
обладаем,
we
и
already
найдем
know that B
вероятность
voted
того, что
yes.
А проголосовал «да», при условии, что нам уже известно, что Б проголосовал «да».
In
Такое
fact,
число
we
мы
have
на
never
самом деле
received
раньше
such a number
сегодня
before.
получали.
But this number is
Число
related to all
связано
the
со
others.
всеми остальными.
In
В
particular,
частности,
it is
оно
related to the
связано с
probability that B will vote
вероятностью
yes,
того, что
and we
Б
just calculated
проголосует
it
«да».
earlier.
Мы вот его как раз вычислили раньше.
Then,
Дальше мы
we can
можем
calculate the
вычислить
probability
вероятность
that I
того,
will
что
vote no.
А
If I
проголосует
voted
«нет»,
yes,
если Б
it will be equal to
проголосовал
this
«да».
number.
Она будет равна вот такому числу.
We can
Также
calculate the
вычислить
probability that A
вероятность
votes
того,
yes
что А
when B votes
проголосует
no.
«да», когда Б проголосовал «нет».
Let's check some
Проверим
composite
числовые
indicators.
показатели.
The probability that A
Вероятность того,
voted
что
yes
А
by the
проголосовал «да»,
probability that
на
B voted
вероятность
yes
того, что
if A
Б
voted yes
проголосовал
is
«да».
indeed equal to the
Если А
probability that A will
проголосовал
vote
«да»,
yes
действительно
multiplied by the
вероятность
probability
того,
that A
что Б
voted
проголосует
yes,
«да»,
provided that he voted
умноженной на
yes.
вероятность того, что А проголосовал «да», при условии, что Б проголосовал «да».
It's the
То
same
же
with
самое
negation.
с отрицанием.
It's the
То
same
же
with denying
самое
something
будет с
else.
отрицанием чего-то другого.
No matter how
Сколько бы
many
мы
of
вот
these
этих
products we
произведений
build,
ни
we will get
построили,
the same
будем
number.
получать одно и то же число.
Because
Потому
this is,
что
for
это,
example, the
например,
probability
вероятность
that they
того,
both
что
voted
они
yes.
оба проголосовали «да».
This is the
Вот это
probability that B
вероятность
voted
того,
yes
что
and
Б
voted no.
проголосовал «да», а А проголосовал «нет».
And on the
И
right, it
справа
says the same.
написана она же.
And so
И
on.
так далее.
Let's do this
Сделаем
very
тот же
numerical
самый
experiment,
эксперимент,
which I
который
promised to
так
do so
давно
long
я
ago.
обещал сделать.
We will put it
Сделать
as
его
follows.
следующим образом.
Let's take
Возьмем
some large
какое-то
number of
большое число
trials, for
испытаний,
example,
например,
10,000.
10 000.
We will generate
Сгенерируем
10,000 random
10
votes,
000
with a
случайных
predetermined probability.
голосований А с заранее заданной вероятностью.
That's where it's
Здесь оно и
written.
написано.
The Bernoulli
Распределение
distribution with the two
Bernoulli
parameters is, in
с
fact,
параметром
a
P
short way to write that
это,
A chooses
собственно,
1 with a
короткий способ,
probability of
как
2
записать,
and 0 with a
что А
probability of
выбирает
1
один
minus
с
p.
вероятностью
Then we conduct
кота
several
и 2 с
auxiliary functions that will help us
вероятностью
find the purity of the outcome
Дальше
we are
ведем
interested
несколько
in, using the
вспомогательных
generated
функций,
random
которые нам
numbers.
помогут по сгенерированным случайным числам находить частоту интересующего нас исхода.
We will make
Еще
another
вспомогательные
auxiliary
функции
function
сделаем,
that will
которые
find the
увидим,
share of
например,
yes
долю
votes
конкретного
specifically, that is
голосования «да», то
units.
есть единицы.
And based
И
on
на
the
основании
generated data,
сгенерированных
which we have
данных,
added up
которые мы
here,
сложили
we
сюда,
will check
проверим,
whether it is
правда
true
ли,
that the
что
probability we set
заданная
for a
нами
sufficiently long
вероятность
series
на
of tests is
достаточно
equal to the
длинной серии
frequency.
испытаний равна частоте.
In other
То есть
words,
правильно ли
does our
работает
random number
генератор
generator
наших
work
случайных
correctly?
чисел?
Well,
Ну, собственно,
actually,
да, с
yes.
ошибкой
With an
где-то там
error,
уже
somewhere there
невероятно
already in the region of 5,000th,
получаем
we
ровно
get
ту
exactly the
самую
same given
заданную
probability.
вероятность.
Now the
Теперь
next
следующий
maneuver.
маневр.
B will vote as
Б
a
будет
copycat.
голосовать как подражатель.
How will this
Как это
happen?
будет происходить?
We will be
Ну,
for
мы
every vote.
для каждого голосования.
See how A voted
Смотрите,
there,
как там
and if he voted
проголосовал
yes,
А.
B will
Если
verify
он
option A
проголосовал
with the
«да»,
probability of PB,
Б
provided
будет
that.
проверять вариант А с вероятностью P, B при условии, что А.
And if I
А
voted
если
no,
он
it makes
проголосовал «нет»,
perfect sense. He will
что он
choose N from B,
будет выбирать
provided
P,
that it
а
is
P
not.
при условии,
Then,
что
we
не
convert
А.
the whole thing
Дальше мы
from a
всё это
Boolean
дело
value to a
преобразуем
number
из
1 or
будущего
0, and get a
значения
similar chain
в
with B's
число,
votes,
выделенное
which are
и
generated
получаем
depending on how A voted.
логическую
Immediately for
цепочку
symmetry,
с
we will make an
голосованием
option
Б,
for the case when A
которая
imitates B.
сгенерирована
Here,
уже
it is simply
зависимо от
repeated,
того,
just
как
the letters are
проголосовал
reversed.
А. Сразу же для симметрии сделаем вариант для того случая, когда А подражает Б. Тут повторено просто оно же, просто буковки поменены местами.
And
И,
finally,
наконец,
we will generate
сгенерируем
these
эти
very
самые
pairwise
парные
data.
данные.
That is,
То есть
data for the
данные
variant when B
для
imitates
варианта,
A,
когда
and
Б
data for the
подражает
variant
А,
when, on the contrary,
и
A
данные
imitates
для
B.
варианта,
They are
когда,
generated in a
наоборот, А
completely
подражает
symmetrical
Б.
way.
Они генерируются совершенно симметричным способом.
There can be
Тут
no
не может
mistake
быть
in the
никакой
operation of the
ошибки
random number
от
generator.
генератора
There are
случайных
really just
чисел,
swapped
реально
variables.
просто помененные местами переменные.
Let's take some
Возьмем
auxiliary functions
вспомогательные
yet,
функции
right?
еще, да.
How often
Как
did A
часто
choose
А
yes?
выбирал «да»,
How
как
often
часто
did B
Б
choose
выбирал «да».
yes? It doesn't matter, we won't go into details here. Let's start using the statistics obtained there above to look at the actual resulting frequencies. In both cases, regardless of who imitated whom, it turns out that purity with an accuracy of up to 1,000 coincides with a predetermined probability. That is, according to this parameter, with all our desire, we would not be able to distinguish one option from another. But exactly the same thing happens with B. This probability was not given to us in advance, we calculated it through others. But nevertheless, in both variants, purity is obtained, which, with an accuracy of up to the same thousandths, coincides with our calculated probability. We can calculate how often they voted yes at the same time. This is also a parameter that was not set in advance. Again, with an accuracy of up to 1,000th, we get a match. This brings us to some pretty important thoughts. Not only can we not distinguish from the observed data who is imitating whom, in fact, we cannot even distinguish one model from another at the model level. If we make a model in which B imitates A, it will give exactly the same results that would give a model in which A imitates B. These are identical models. By any of their manifestations, we cannot know who is imitating whom. We can only look into the code and see how it is written in the code. And it is on this idea that identical models can be made, that almost the entire article on the mathematical foundations of direct democracy is actually built. There, we select certain parameters for one model, so that this model gives exactly the same results as another model with other parameters. And accordingly, we compare these parameters with each other, discovering all these interesting patterns. In particular, the fact that in a direct democracy, each of its participants should be much less likely to guess the correct option than if it was guessed by a single dictator. However, we have now experimentally verified that we cannot distinguish who is imitating whom. And can we distinguish the case when there is imitation from the case when there is no imitation? More precisely, we already know that we can. We have identified this analytically before. But let's test it on an experiment. Let's make another model in which they vote independently of each other. And we will calculate all the same indicators for these models. In all three models, of course, the probability that A chose option yes and that B chose option yes is the same. In other words, according to this parameter, all three models do not differ. However, if we calculate the probability that they both chose the option yes, we will find this is the most previously identified difference. In a fashion with independent voting, it is approximately equal to the product of probabilities, and in models with dependent voting, it is already very significantly different from the product of probabilities. If we remember about such an indicator as correlation, it will be exactly the same with it. In dependent models, it is noticeable differently from zero. In independent voting, it is approximately equal to zero. And it would seem, here it is, we have discovered a stumbling block. Indeed, the model with independent voting is not the same as the model with dependent. However, let's make one interesting feint with our ears. Let's change the probability with which B chooses option yes in the independent model. Instead of n from B, we substitute here the probability of n from B, provided that at the same time, the voting itself will continue to remain independent. We just took the numerical value the same, didn't make the vote dependent. And then, it turns out unexpected, although quite logical expected. In this case, the model with independent voting will give exactly the same purity of the joint choice of the yes option as the models with dependent voting. If we used only this parameter, the models would be indistinguishable for us. This means that for a model with independent voting, we can really pick up such probabilities that we get exactly the same alignment that we got when voting dependent. Naturally, if we calculate some other indicators, we will still be able to distinguish these models. In particular, the probability that A removes option yes is the same in all models, but the probability that B chooses option yes, of course, is no longer the same. Well, not surprising. We substituted another probability here and got it here at the exit. By correlation, of course, we can easily distinguish this too. Dependent voting will still give excellent, but also correlation, and independent voting close to zero. All this means that with full statistics, we can really distinguish which model is currently operating on the experiment. But according to one single indicator, we can always choose the parameters of one model in such a way as to get exactly the same results as the other model. Moreover, we can choose not only the probability for B, but we can choose the probabilities for A and B so that they are the same, and the indicator we are interested in would still turn out to be the same. Well, to do this, let's use the previously known ratio for independent voting. Let's assume that we need identical probabilities, that is, the previous expression turns like this. Then we solve it. We can substitute specific numbers and get some probability equal for A and B, in which the probability that they both vote yes will be completely identical to the model with dependent voting. And of course, we can check this numerically. In exactly the same way as before, we will generate data on independent voting. Now, with the equal probability calculated by us for A and B, let's look at this very criterion, how often they both voted yes. Let's make sure that indeed, yes, they voted with the same frequency, with an accuracy of up to thousands. And we will also make sure that there are naturally others according to the IP, but actually they are equal to the same thing that we gave the random number generator. As the probability of choosing option 1 with correlation will be the same, this is also about 0, since the vote is independent. That is, indeed, we can build many models that differ in device, but choose their parameters so that the indicator of interest to us, for all these models, is completely identical. The only thing we could assume is that we checked everything once. Maybe it coincided so much, that's how random numbers fell out, that the indicator we are really interested in turned out to be identical in all models. And if we try to do the same thing again, it will turn out different. But it's a random process, right? It could have been a coincidence. Let's make sure that this is not a coincidence. So we will reduce the number of votes within each experiment, otherwise it will work for too long. Let them vote 100 times as part of the attempt, but there will be 10,000 attempts. Let's use previously created models, that is, a model with voting, where B imitates a model with voting, where B votes with this probability, he is independent, and finally, a model where they both vote with the same probability, which we also calculated earlier. Let's introduce some additional functions there and build a histogram for all three models. And we will see, despite the fact that there is indeed a certain scatter from test to test, but this scatter itself is almost identical for all three models. These histograms are almost exactly superimposed on each other. Well, yes, there is a slight difference, but it's really some hundreds thousandths of a fraction. In other words, all these three models do not just give the same average, they give the same scatter around this average. We could not distinguish them even by this statistical criterion, having tested them many times in array, and then building histograms. In some other case, in the case of some deeper non-identity of the models, the histograms could diverge if the average coincides. And here they overlap, that is, these models are really indistinguishable. All of the above can be considered as such a long explanation of the basic provisions of probability theory. It was a little bit tied to direct democracy, but nevertheless, it was basically different from it. Because there are all two people there, they somehow vote, we count cases when they both voted. Yes, and this is not the same as what the articles were evaluated, and not the same as what is usually said. There we consider the choice of some option, by a majority vote, and not at all a joint vote of two people. But nevertheless, exactly the same logic leads us to exactly the same conclusion in the case of choosing the option by a majority of votes too. For simplicity, in order to understand how this case works, let's first consider the simplest case when only 3 people vote and choose yes or no by a majority of votes. In this case, how can we find out the probability that the yes option will be chosen by a majority of votes? Well, just sort through all the possible options, but how could he have been chosen? Suppose we have 3 participants A, B, and C. B and C. Let them be imitators of A, and completely identical imitators. That is, they have exactly the same probabilities among themselves. Let's go through all the options when 2 or 3 voted yes. That is, as a result, the yes option was chosen by a majority of votes. It may be that A voted yes, B voted yes, C voted no. The probability is identical, so it doesn't say B here. There may be an option that A voted yes, B voted no, C voted yes. There may be an option that A voted no, B and C voted yes, and finally, an option when all 3 voted yes. If we multiply the probabilities standing in each row, and then we calculate, we will get the probability of choosing yes by a majority of votes that interests us. Accordingly, if we simplify it later, we will get some such expression. I don't know who wants to, can check it out. There is no special point in checking it. It's all automatically done. Substitute specific numbers, the same ones that were used earlier in the checks, and calculate for this particular case the probability of choosing the yes option by a majority vote. Note that we still used exactly the same 3 ratios as before. And really, in all such cases, they will be about the same, only their combinations will become more and more difficult to read and to comprehend. But anyway, we will continue to solve similar problems. Now let's pick up, and with what probability would they have to vote independently of each other in order to get exactly the same result for this indicator? According to the probability, choose the option yes by a majority vote. I'm actually too lazy to do it manually, so I took advantage of the built-in features. What does it say here, right? We have a probability, this is the one that we calculated earlier, should be equal to the probability that x, that is, the number of votes scored for the option yes, is greater than or equal to 2. Despite the fact that these very votes have a binomial distribution, but this is such an easy way to describe this most independent vote of 3 participants, each of whom chooses the option yes, with a probability of 0. Wolfram counted this case and transformed it into this expression. It's a cubic equation, actually. He has a solution that is beautifully recorded analytically. No. It turns out to be a very long expression, so we put it in this form, for brevity, right? It just says the second root of this cubic equation here. Cubic equations have only 3 roots in general, but we are interested in the only one that lies in the range from 0 to 1. It is guaranteed to be there. What we actually can see by plotting a graph where passy x is this probability that interests us, and passy y is what probability should be equal for everyone to get this probability, that is, the probability of choosing the option yes by the majority. We see that there is indeed a solution to this equation at all points, and the second root is the same, because it lies in the range from 0 to 1. By substituting, we can also check that everything is calculated correctly, everything is fine. For our numbers, which we have used as an example everywhere here, there should be such an equal probability for everyone. And then, we will get the probability of choosing the yes option by a majority of votes like this. In other words, in order to choose a certain option by a majority of votes, it is also possible to build another model with an independent vote of 3 participants. Instead of a model when the second and third imitate the first, it is possible to choose parameters for it, that is, the probability with which they should independently choose yes, and get exactly the same probability of choosing yes by a majority of votes as for dependent voting. The task may look more complicated, but nevertheless, there is a solution. Interestingly, it has even more complex tasks. Before we go to them, we will check this case numerically in exactly the same way. We will do many checks, within which they will vote according to these two models, with independent voting, and with an independent one. We generate this data, build a histogram for them, and again make sure that both models give not only the same average, but even the same distribution. That is, again, according to this indicator, these models are completely identical. And then, of course, a more complicated option is the voting of a large number of participants, not 3, but thousands, millions, any number that we call n. Despite the fact that the formulas there are much more cumbersome, the logic behind these formulas is exactly the same as it was when 3 participants voted. And the selection, equal for all probabilities, is done, in fact, in the same way. However, before moving on to this more complex model, let's try, for general reasons, to make some assumptions about how this vote should behave when copycats appear. Suppose we have a society of 1 million people, but this million people are so heavily bombed that they imitate one person. When we had a vote of 3 participants, for us the voice of this person was important, well, that is, taking into account this very voice. This is still 1 vote out of 3, a very significant contribution. When we have 1 million participants, we can actually ignore this 1 vote and perceive the situation as if it is not some participant encouraging everyone to vote one way or another, but some kind of abstract propaganda that somehow zombies everyone with one intensity or another. So, if this propaganda absolutely zombies everyone, that is, it imposes its opinion in such a way that there is no way out of it at all, as each participant simply obediently goes and does what he was told. It is quite clear that such a system is indistinguishable from the dictator's vote. In other words, propaganda, in fact, votes. If it comes from one person, then, despite the fact that the democratic process is imitated here, in reality, it is just his wool. If everyone votes independently, we have another extreme option, an independent vote. And what happens if not everyone imitates some? Well, for the sake of certainty, let's assume that half of the population is zombified by one propaganda, and the other half is bombed by another propaganda. It is quite obvious that such a system, it is identical to a direct democracy, consisting of 2 people. Again, some kind of democratic process is being simulated here, but in reality, we have only 2 voters, propaganda 1 and propaganda 2, exactly the same. If the population is divided into 3/3, equal in number, each of which is completely zombified by some kind of propaganda, this is a vote of 3 people. Whatever proportions we choose in zombification, we will get a kind of intermediate option between the choice of a single person, that is, a dictator, and an independent vote of everyone. Actually, this thing seems so obvious to me that I didn't even mention it in a special way. Therefore, I was very surprised when a lot of people started asking why we are considering an independent vote here. Because there is propaganda. I even answered this question sometimes, apparently not in the sense in which I was asked it. Because it is obvious to me that any intermediate model with propaganda, it will lie between these 2 extreme cases. And it seemed to people that we could go beyond one of these cases and get an option that is, as it were, worse than that of a dictator, or maybe better than that of an independent vote, suspecting that it still meant that it was worse than that of a dictator. But this is technically impossible. Even if everyone is brainwashed by a single dictator, we have it identical to the dictator's vote. If, on the contrary, we have a bunch of propaganda that pulls everyone in different directions, but this is almost an independent vote, simply because these propagandists pull everyone in different directions. If people vote in half of the cases, as propaganda has said, well, or there, let's say, half of the people are subject to this propaganda, well, there will be some intermediate option. We will never go beyond the edges. And that is why it makes sense for us to consider only 2 extreme cases. One of them describes the worst situation, the other the best, and everything else will be somewhere in between. It's better than the worst, it's worse than the best, it's all obvious. But nevertheless, if such a question arises, we will still analyze these intermediate cases too, including in order to make sure that it really lies somewhere in the middle, and there can be no other way. That is, this is not my bold assumption, but in fact it is. Moreover, we will check this numerically on exactly the same experiments as were done before. To begin with, let's consider the following model with propaganda. We will ignore the person who is spreading this propaganda. Let's assume that this is just some kind of abstract propaganda. Then, propaganda is included in some votes, and in some votes it is not included. Accordingly, the ratio of these two options is set by this very coefficient, the pressure of propaganda, yes, a certain propre, that is, how often it turns on. Then, if it is turned on, all participants vote for the yes option with a probability of p vista samples. If it does not turn on, they vote for the yes option with the probability of a trial run. Accordingly, in order to find this generalized probability that the participants will choose option 1 by a majority of votes, we will consider two cases. The probability of including propaganda, obviously, is equal to this very proproid, that is, the proportion of cases in which it turned on, and to purity. And at the same time, let's assume that we have a function that, according to the number of participants, and according to a given probability, tells with what probability they will vote for the yes option. We'll talk about this feature later. So, in this case, we know the probability from this function. We multiply it by the probability that there was a case when propaganda turned on, and to this, we add the second case, the probability given to us by function f, but with a different probability for each participant, multiplied by the probability that propaganda did not turn on. The sum of these two options will just give us the average probability on the entire set of possible options. Then, we will try to pull off exactly the same trick. Let's select a certain frequency common to all participants of the equal, such that the voting of the same n participants, with such a probability, will give the probability of choosing option n1, exactly the same as we wrote here. Well, substitute this very n1 here, we get a longer expression. Next, let's deal with this very function. Again, I will not bother with the details, I will write directly in the term tungsten. We are interested in the probability that the number of votes of x is greater than or equal to n in half, despite the fact that x has a binomial distribution with n participants, and probability p. The probability of n and n participants is passed to us here as parameters, but here we fill them with specific values. Well, in place of n, we have n, but the probabilities are substituted for different ones. If this probability is calculated automatically, we get a completely unreadable expression. The gamma function is actually a generalized factorial. In other words, there could be factorials here, since we have all integers. This is a beta feature, but it doesn't matter. If we substitute our original equations for this case, we will get something completely unreadable, and it does not have a good analytical solution, but we can make sure that it always has a numerical solution. To do this, let's take some specific values of some parameters. In fact, they could have taken any. Well, for example, 100 people, we will have a probability of choosing the option yes under the influence of propaganda. 0 as many as 7/10, and the probability that propaganda will turn on this time is 0 as many as 5/10. We will substitute this case into this equation, into which, in turn, this function has already been substituted. We get an equation with two unknowns already. Here we have n equal and n no samples. We can plot numerical solutions. This is the equation for each value of n, but samples from 0 to 1. The graph will turn out like this. I don't know, maybe someone can guess such graphs by the type of expression, and I can't. I understand that there will be some kind of consistent curve there, but I can't immediately guess which one. But nevertheless, yes, we solved this equation in quite a large number of points. We see that it certainly has a solution at each point, because it is smooth, continuous. That is, everything is fine with this function. No matter what parameters we choose, we can always choose a pixel for them. But nevertheless, this model of propaganda is not the only one. We can consider the second option, an alternative version of propaganda. Let the propaganda work every time, but not for all people. Instead of setting the probability that propaganda will turn on at a given time, we will set the probability that it will affect a given person. A trial rate is, in fact, the proportion of people who were affected by propaganda, or the probability that it will affect a particular individual. If it worked, he votes with the probability of Pev's samples. If it did not work, with the probability of P new samples. We will now solve an equation of this kind. We no longer have two cases, we have only one case, but within the framework of it, people are divided into two groups. Therefore, the function that determines the probability of choosing the yes option by a majority of votes for a given probability is equal to a certain second function, but within this function, it is already taken into account that people were divided into two groups. Those who were affected by the propaganda, those who were not affected by it. This function is slightly more complex than the previous one. In particular, we believe that we have two groups of people, within these two groups of binomial distribution. In one, the number of people like this, that is, these are those who were affected by propaganda, is determined, but like this. We simply multiply n by the proportion of people who were affected by propaganda and round it up to an integer. In the second group of people, those who were not affected by propaganda, they're n minus those who were affected by it. They vote in one case with the probability of vis pro, in the other case with the probability of n no pro, and we need the sum of their votes to be greater than or equal to half of the participants, that is, n and half. In the previous case, we have some kind of analytical expression for f turned out, in this case, there is apparently no beautiful expression. That is, for each specific n, we can write up to a fig of terms, and their number grows very quickly depending on n. But for abstract n, we cannot write this matter down as some beautiful sum. Or we can, but I do not know how. But be that as it may, in any case, it is impossible to solve this case analytically, and it will still be solved numerically. And it is enough for us that it can be calculated at each point. In other words, put the parameters here, and get some kind of numerical value. We will also choose exactly how many people, for example, 20. Yes, let's assume that the probability of choosing the option yes under the influence of propaganda is 0 as many as 7/10. The probability that human propaganda will work is 0 as many as 5/10. Substitute this into this equation, where in turn f2 is put, we get this expression. Here, by the way, there is this very sum, yes, of terms with degrees already. For 20 people, it more or less fits on the screen, yes. Well, anyway, we have two unknowns again, p equal and p no. It's a kind of captivity, in this case of the fifth degree. But in general there can be any degree there, but nevertheless, despite the lack of an analytical solution, there is always a numerical solution. We can also plot exactly and make sure that this problem is solved at each point. That is, whichever propaganda option we choose, and both there and there, we can choose such a parameter for independent voting, that the probability of choosing the yes option will be the same. At the same time, it is clear that, if we try to implement the propaganda option, it does not work every time, and not at all. It will be a kind of superposition of the two options considered. In other words, the results for this model will lie between what the model with one version of propaganda gives, and what the model with another version of propaganda gives. We will not consider a more complex case separately, just consider two extreme cases with this very propaganda. Now actually, what are we picking up there? But generally speaking, we can select in any order, just choose the second model of propaganda, as a kind of basic one for certainty, and we will adjust the rest to it. In other words, we need to set the probability that a person with propaganda will vote yes, the probability that he votes without propaganda, yes, and the pressure of this very second propaganda, which part of the people it affects in each act. Accordingly, we take the second equation, calculate the equal from it, then, substituting it into the first equation, calculate the propre for the first version of propaganda, and thus get the full set of parameters. Here, in fact, this is what is written. We took the second equation, that is this one, we numerically found a quel from it, we put the quel here. We got this indicator, yes, what is this left part equal to?
показатель, да, чему вот эта левая часть равна.
Then,
Дальше вот
it
здесь
says
написано,
here,
нашли вот
we
этот
found this
prop
proped
rate,
actually from the
собственно,
resulting
из
equation,
получившегося
and thus got a full
уравнения,
set of
и таким
parameters,
образом
including
получили
those that we
полный
did
набор
not set.
параметров, включая те, которые мы не задавали.
Plus,
Плюс
we
к
will
этому
use some
мы
default
будем
values
использовать
and
какие-то
find something
значения
like
по
this construction.
умолчанию и находить вот примерно такую вот конструкцию.
That is,
То есть все
all
параметры
parameters
для
for
всех
all models,
моделей,
so
так,
that all three
чтобы
models give
все
the same
три
result.
модели дали один и
Well,
тот же
okay,
результат.
here I
Ну,
have
вот
some
здесь
abstract
какие-то
parameters.
абстрактные
Yes,
параметры, да,
substituted,
некие,
some
например,
0 as many as
десятки,
5/10.
но
Maybe they
конкретно
work
для
specifically
работы
for
для
this,
всего
but not
остального
for
нет.
everything
И,
else. And of
естественно, мы
course,
можем
we
это
can check it
проверить
for a variety
для
of
самых
conditions
разных
and
условий,
check it
еще
numerically.
проверить численно.
To do this,
Для этого
we will
будем
use exactly the
пробовать
same
теми же
methods as
способами, как и
before
раньше,
to generate voting
генерировать
data for
данные
all three models.
преобразования для всех трех моделей.
At the same
При
time,
этом в
as
качестве
parameters of these
параметров этих
models,
моделей
we will
будем
use those
использовать
parameters
те
that we found
параметры,
with the
которые
help of the
нашли
Saber
при
function
помощи
that was on the
самой
previous
функции,
slide.
которая была на предыдущем слайде.
And having
И
generated the
сгенерировав
parameters,
параметры,
we will
будем
make sure
убеждаться, что
that indeed with
действительно с
such
такими
parameters,
параметрами
all
все
three
три
models
модели
generating, I note
генерируются
again,
имеющие
different
форму
ways of
разные.
voting, two with
То есть
different
вот
propaganda,
голосование
one with
два
independent
абсолютно
voting.
пропагандами, один с независимым голосованием.
So,
Так вот,
all these three
все
models
эти
give
три
completely
модели
identical,
дают
indistinguishable results from each
совершенно
other.
идентичные, неотличимые друг от друга результаты.
That is,
То есть по
according to
данным
this parameter of the probability of choosing option 1 by a majority of votes, they are indistinguishable.
неотличимы.
Accordingly, we will
Соответственно,
begin to
начнем
substitute.
подставлять.
We will substitute
Подставлять мы
only
будем
those
только
numbers
те
that
числа,
differ from the
которые
ones set here by
отличаются,
default.
вот здесь по
Well,
умолчанию.
it's purely for
Числа
brevity,
вкратце,
yes.
да.
The
Первое,
first
что
thing we
мы
check
проверяем,
is how it
то, как
works
оно
when
работает, когда
propaganda is turned
пропаганда у нас
off. The RAID
отключена.
samples in both
Просто
cases are
проверить
zero,
первый
that
случай
is,
с ноль, то есть
propaganda does not
пропаганда
work.
действует.
The probability
Вероятность
that a
того,
person
что
will vote for the yes option without
без
propaganda
пропаганды
is zero as
обладает
much as
данным
55
ценностью
hundredths.
для
The
сотов,
PCL is really calculated to be identical. Who would doubt it? And all three models behave like a model with an independent vote. If propaganda is disabled for them, everything is fine. The averages are the same, the histograms are superimposed on each other. Then the next option is that propaganda is always turned on, but at the same time, the probability of voting with propaganda turned on is 1 second. We really get a PKL equal to 0 by a whole 5/10. In other words, it is the same as a model with a vote without propaganda and independent. Again, all three averages coincided, they are approximately equal to 0 by a whole 5/10. This is logical for this case, right? The histograms are almost the same again. If we take more attempts, it will generally seem that this is one histogram. That is, they will directly overlap each other better than we can draw on such a graph. But nevertheless, it was checked such extreme cases, yes, that or to find out if we did not make some obvious mistake. Apparently not. Indeed, in these extreme cases, we have the impression that propaganda does not work, because they are extreme. Now let's consider some variant where propaganda does not always work, and not at all. Let's say, for example, it acts on 80% of the population. If it worked, vote with a probability of 0.6 of the option. If it did not work, vote with a probability of 0.52 for the option yes. Again, it was picked up by ICFL. It was picked up about the RAID, in this case, in 93% of cases. Propaganda should be included, and everyone should be inclined to this option. Again, the average is identical. Again, the histograms superimposed on each other very well. Another option. See, propaganda affects a small part of people. Yes, there are 5%. With propaganda, the probability of voting is 9/10. Without propaganda, 0.52 hundredths. All the averages coincided again. The histograms overlapped again. So you can continue for a very long time with a variety of values. I'm doing some more examples here, but each time it turns out the same average with an accuracy of up to 1,000 and overlapping histograms. But most importantly, we can consider the general case. Let's fix several parameters in the form of sliders and plot the dependence of the probability of choosing yes by a majority of votes on, say, the probability that each of the participants chooses the option yes without the influence of propaganda. In this case, we have a propaganda rate of 0.5. This means that, in the first model, propaganda is included on average every second time, and in the second model, it affects half of the participants. At the same time, the probability of voting yes with propaganda is 0.5. Here, we observe the very situation that we logically deduced at the very beginning of the construction of all these graphs. We have an extreme case, this green one. This vote is absolutely independent. There is a blue schedule. This is a vote when propaganda always works. It is not for everyone. And there is an orange schedule, voting when propaganda acts on everyone, but not always. We have eliminated the probability with which the dictator would have made the elections. And indeed, these two models with propaganda, with a probability greater than 0.5 for each participant, they are better than how the dictator would choose, but at the same time worse than it would be with an independent vote. If we raid propaganda, for the first model is the purity with which propaganda is turned on, and for the second model, it is the proportion of participants on whom it has affected, we aim to 0, we will see that both models have merged with green, that is, with independent voting. If we stream it to 1, they will merge with a straight line, as if the participants voted under the absolute influence of propaganda, that is, on everyone and every time. At the same time, if we start changing the probability of how participants vote with propaganda, we will still observe the same picture, starting from some point. That is, here, for example, it's about 0.6. Starting from this point, the orange and blue graph lie above the voting schedule with absolute propaganda influence, and under the schedule with independent voting. Before that, they also lie between them, just the green one turns out to be the lowest, and the graph with the absolute influence of propaganda is the top one. It is for these reasons that we could simply compare the green option with this feature. The other two will be between them, no matter how we change their parameters. But nevertheless, we can draw some conclusions from this model, in particular, to understand what this point is, why the discrepancy begins with it. In fact, this is the point. This is the very value at which the participant himself is more likely to vote yes than the propaganda said. That is, after this point, independent voting begins to win. And up to this point, propaganda really helps to choose option 1. In any case, even up to this point, the dictator in this case, if he had voted exactly the way propaganda inclines people, he would have voted with a probability of about 0.6. But all three models, starting from some point, it is above this graph, that is, they all three win, and after some point, they still begin to lose to an independent vote. If propaganda, accordingly, greatly reduces the probability of choosing the option, yes, we have a slightly different picture. Yes, the charts already behave differently, but nevertheless, the dictator, starting from some point, they all start winning at some point. That is, the dictator would have chosen the option yes, with a probability of, well, there is 0 as much as 1/10. Starting from this point, an independent vote would have been more likely to choose the option yes, and then from some point, and the option with propaganda would also have begun to do the same. It should be noted here, I take a very small number of participants. For what reason? If I take a relatively small number of participants, for example, there are 100, it will be very difficult to make out what is happening. Here, all these ups become literally lightning fast. Note this, there are still 100 participants there, and with 1,000,000 of them, you generally observed vertical lines. Therefore, in order to see something, I'm looking at the option with 11 participants. Well, that's actually how all three models behave. We can probably draw some additional conclusions about this. I even have some ideas, but nevertheless, this is a kind of clarification, not an alternative. Because we can't do better than an extreme case anyway. No models with propaganda will make the situation better than him. And on the other hand, no matter how clever we are, they will either merge with the green graph or merge with this straight line here. They will not be able to go beyond it. Finally, I'll show you how it looks in 3 dimensions. That is, there we recorded the probability of choosing the yes option under the influence of propaganda, but here it will be one of the axes. and we will only change the rate. But the number of participants is still right. Here are two graphs drawn here. If we look at them in profile, these are our two two-dimensional cases. This is how the majority will vote, depending on how likely they are to vote independently for the yes option, with propaganda completely disabled. And this is how we see the graph. How would people vote with the probability that propaganda provides them if it works for everyone? These are, as it were, the limiting limiters of the other two models. These two models fall between them. Accordingly, if we reduce the propaganda rate to 0, both models will merge with one of the graphs, and if we increase it to 1, both models will merge with the other, and in the intermediate case, they will lie between these two. Here is the situation. In other words, these are really, in a sense, two marginal states, beyond which it is impossible to get out, under any influence of propaganda. Well, actually, this is where I finish my report. I hope that at least some questions have been clarified. Although I understand that the second part was very complicated, and the fact that I explained something there in the first part, it may not have led to the full understanding described in the second. You may have to reconsider again to understand this better. But nevertheless, it is possible to ask questions now, to discuss this matter already in the mode of free dialogue. Well, plus, I will answer the questions that were asked earlier, including in the comments. Let's start the conversation. I see that there are not very many questions received. Either everyone understands everything, or it's so unclear that people don't even know what to ask about it. Therefore, I will monitor incoming questions out of the corner of my eye, and at the same time answer what was asked before and what. Well, what was asked in the comments under some videos or in a blog. Today I received a question. Well, by the way, it is very interesting, and the next program will be partly related to this kind of questions. I'm going to read it out in its entirety. Sorry, it's quite long, but in order to understand it better, nevertheless, it will probably have to be completely. The principle of one person, one vote has a problem, which is expressed in the fact that many people may not care what they vote for, and it may turn out that in the end, an indifferent majority will ultimately determine the result of the vote. In order to counteract such a process, a quadratic vote was invented. The idea is for the referendum elections to include a fee for voting according to the formula. According to the formula, for X rubles, you get the square root of X votes. That is, half a voice can be bought for 25 kopecks, 1 vote for 1 ruble, 10,000 votes for 100 million rubles. To buy 1,000,000 votes, that is, a little less than 100 of the Russian voters, you will need 1 and, how much is there? 12 zeros, 1 trillion rubles. In other words, the fact that the price increases quadratically, in practice removes the question that someone can buy elections. What's the big deal here? First, a general consideration. As soon as we change the weight of the vote in any way, we are guaranteed to get at least one method for abuse. At least one. Usually there are more of them, and some of them, but they are almost on the surface. That is, they will find them very quickly. This case is no exception. Interestingly, in a number of computer and board games, they also try to simulate voting in some way. And among other things, it models the purchase of votes and options with a nonlinear price, as if voices, they were also tested there. But there it is done for gaming interest, that is, it is an element of some kind of excitement, an element of some kind of strategy. The same thing that is invented in games will be invented in practice too, it is almost guaranteed. Since we assume that votes can be bought, alas, they will be bought. The price is high, but it's good, they will buy from someone else. That is, instead of getting the root of the paid money myself, I persuaded 100 people and will pay a much smaller amount for the same number of votes. Well, we say, it can be banned. Well, yes, you can. You can prohibit buying votes, but they do it anyway. That is, it seems to be illegal, but they do. The same thing happens with what I specifically wanted to analyze in the next program. These are attempts to change the weight of the voice based on how a person guessed at previous times. I guessed, and according to a purely objective indicator, that is, he guessed how the majority would vote, we consider him a kind of oracle, and we increase his weight with it. There are strategies lying on the surface that will lead to the fact that again not what we want will be achieved, but some kind of fraud. The same thing is likely to happen here, and I named one option right off the bat. I am sure that if you think about it for at least an hour, you can name 5 options. And if you think about it, you can probably call a month 30. And maybe 100 even. If some modifications are made, yes, it will be harder to come up with, but it's still possible. Well, in other words, it's just a kind of support, yes, not for a specific case, not for a specific proposal, but for the general principle as a whole. If we change the weight of the voice in some way, we automatically open the ground for manipulation. That is, this idea in itself, it is interesting there for a mathematician, or a logician, or an algorithmist. But in practice, unfortunately, it will not work as it seems at first, but rather the opposite. So further, these are now going to be disorderly scraps that have remained from previous times, so do not be surprised that they seem to be unrelated to each other in any way. About democracy in the army and a set of considerations. The commander is in the game. It's like a squad leader storming a house. This was asked in the context of computer games and democratic governance in them, so the game is mentioned there. In terms of the site, play. I didn't play, but nevertheless, I believe, even the chosen clan commander happens to be there. With direct democracy, in the event of war, it will be possible to choose Stalin, who, in spite of the stupid people, will drag everything into one helmet. Here a person is being ironic. Do not think that he really thinks so, but nevertheless. So the supporters of totalitarianism can sleep peacefully. Crowds of citizens under a single command defeated professional knights. So there was a military hierarchy. Well, in general, it would be necessary to ask Zhukov which army is fighting better, with or without one man's support. The thing is, it's unknown. There are a number of things we can't test with a good enough experiment. The most obvious of them are some things that are associated with the cultivation of full-fledged or incomplete people. And for ethical reasons, we can't take a person and specifically not teach him anything and see what happens. In the case of the army, exactly the same problem. Such an experiment will lead to a large number of human casualties. Therefore, we can't take 2 armies, one specifically, well, let it go into battle to prove some concept. Because of this, all the statistics are historical, which we have cut see. And separately, this is complicated by another nuance. The fact is that... Okay, now, just a second. Yeah. Now, the fact is that when we check how someone, well, some living person, or some group of people reacts to something, it is very difficult for us to abstract not only from ethics, but also from the background. We take and look, well, this is an example of a real experiment, with the help of which people tried to prove that recording a lecture with a pen on paper is better than recording on a laptop. We take 2 groups, well, a group of students, divide it into 2 parts, and look at who remembered what in what proportion, while some wrote with a pen on paper, while others took notes on a laptop. And we get a profitable option for us. Well, or just some, yes, which we interpret as proof. And really, what have we checked? We checked that this pattern works on this group. Why did we check exactly this? But because we don't have a group that is equally good at conspiracy on paper and in a laptop. We wanted to find such people, but it's clearly not them. And as a result, we checked that it turns out like this for them at the moment. And it's the same thing with armies. That is, the army, which has been training there for a decade, with a single beginning, and to fight, if we tell it, well, from tomorrow direct democracy, it will fight worse, it's true. But exactly the same thing will happen with the army, which is used to graft democracy. And we will tell her now you have a boss. And there will be a lot of problems there too. Yes, someone comes up, gives me an order. I ask him, who are you anyway? He says I'm the boss. We introduced one in the beginning. I say, but I didn't like something. Well, deal with everyone, yes. It's impossible to even force it, because we need to recruit some people who will do this. In computer games, it's easier. People play for them, they are for entertainment, and the game can be played many times, the stakes are not very high there. Therefore, in this regard, games turn out to be a more successful field for experiments, because there a person can practice both this way of playing, and this, and some other way. And a lot of people can do this, we can combine and compare them there in different ways. This is done at the same time. In other words, there is such entertainment as democracy games, when people take and play for one country on democratic principles in some way, but not at first. With any of the possible democracies, they decide how to go or what strategy to adhere to there. At the same time, they can, let's say, delegate the right to move units to someone, but at the same time they will decide where to move them. At the same time they will choose the one who moves, that is, it is a mixture of representative democracy and direct. That is, there are a lot of options to try. But interestingly, they all show performance. That is, the truth is that people play in this way, at least as well as the average player. They usually play better than him. In other words, perhaps if we take a world champion and some crowd of people who play for entertainment, they will probably lose to him. But on the other hand, individually, each of them would also lose to him. So it's not a fact that we proved that it doesn't work. Maybe if we gathered a group of 30 or 40 world champions there, well, at some time, yes, not at the same time, they once were. And against the current champion, they would have been offered to play on the principles of direct democracy, they might have beaten him. This, by the way, is well displayed in the series The Queen's Move, where there is a group of American chess players trying to collectively beat the Soviet one, knowing that the Soviet one is also helped by groups too. And moreover, they specifically note that there, they say they are doing it right. And we have everyone playing for himself there. This is also not quite right according to the series, but okay, let's not go into details. Therefore, it is very difficult to check on the experiment firm. We will have to check it on the games. And many people will talk about it, but on the game of initiative, you type on a real case check, and on the real type, there is too much risk. Therefore, we will have to change the reality for this matter at the games, and then, for a long time to train. But there are no other options. All other options are worse, as exemplified by the over to fig endless wars that have been going on all over the planet for many millennia and are still going on. Most people usually don't need them at all. They are needed by a small group of beneficiaries. There are dictators, politicians, some businessmen. So, the next question is also long. I understand that in some cases, for the sake of a great future, it is necessary to give up meat in the present. I don't quite understand what is being said. However, in your objection, they say, there is no such need for unpopular decisions. I see the guile in this. Objectively, such situations are very common, and this is the standard dilemma between short-term and long-term benefits. All investing is built on such dilemmas. With a direct democracy, the housing and communal services of the house will be transferred to the management of residents. Then, for example, the question arises, let's install energy-saving light bulbs, gas meters, insulate the roof, etc. It will pay off in 10 years. But, here and now, each of the tenants has to pay 5,000 rubles. By the way, it is unclear why it is necessary to pay for light bulbs now. A strange example. It is a classic unpopular decision, and such decisions must be made constantly. And then, there are some more examples. Well, I must say, there are few examples here. There are many more examples of how, under the guise of an unpopular decision within the same housing and communal services, an order that is unnecessary to residents is pushed through simply by collusion with a firm, or something profitable in a housing management company, and again unprofitable for residents. An example of this is the fees for capital repairs, which radically exceed in their amount for a long period of time. How much this repair will actually cost later? Residents refuse. They are told, well, this is such an unpopular decision. It is necessary. The house will need to be repaired. Someone counts and says, but with this money that you collect, you can repair the entire street. They say yes. You don't understand, you're not experts. And there are orders of magnitude more such examples. That is, of course, in a direct democracy, there is a possibility that they will not guess. And some unpopular, but useful solution in quotes will not pass, but a lot of unpopular useless solutions will be cut off. But on the contrary, even harmful ones. At the same time, the opinion that people cannot plan ahead is generally incorrect. That is, most of the Reds are quite planning ahead. Another thing is that in some cases, they have well-founded doubts that they are really being offered something good, and they are trying to breed them for money out of the blue. Well, as it is, please. A lot of people install themselves, well, some kind of energy-saving systems. People put water filters on their taps. It also doesn't pay off in 3 minutes, but they're in years. A person, knowing that it can be hot in summer, puts an air conditioner on himself in winter. Well, or they're in early spring. This is planning for the future. That is, everything is normal. In a number of countries, they make the gentrification of the territory a collective decision. It doesn't pay off at all, except emotionally. We look, and we are pleased, but they pass nevertheless. The more habits people have for this, the more often they guess the correct options, and the less often they cut off what will really be useful to them. But in theory, everyone knows how to do it from the very beginning. Therefore, a small number of examples when it was necessary, but they did not, and it is not an argument in itself. We consider a statistical gain and not a gain in a particular case. Next, if the decision is made only by those whom they affect, how to limit this circle? Example, we are building a federal highway. It needs to be straight and level in order to save the effort of building materials. The decision will be made only by the local community, on whose greens the highway or the whole country will pass. I have already said this, but I will repeat myself specifically about the principles of choice. We cannot say in advance, right now at the design stage, how it should be, because there is no correct answer there. This will be worked out by universal vote. This is the division of spheres, and most likely iteratively. That is, they will almost certainly not guess the first time. Therefore, when I answer this case now, I will say what seems right to me, but this does not mean that it is objectively correct. Yes, this is my version. In other words, in my opinion, the highway that is far from populated areas, at some distance. Now we will not find fault with the exact distance. Yes, it seems to belong to everyone equally. And when the highway is close to a locality, or in it, it seems to relate more to those who live inside that locality. That is, by general agreement, they should indicate at least some place where it will take place, but on the other hand, they strongly influence the choice of this place. Why? Well, because they will sort out the results, and the rest will only drive. Well, I mean, in this place they will sort out the results. It's not particularly critical between localities, so everyone can vote for the project equally. But I say, this is my version. Maybe there is some better one. One more question. Conflict of interest. Canton A decides to build a pulp mill and builds. Canton B down the river has already built a beach there, where residents of 3 neighboring countries rest. 1,000 people live in Canton A. Only 100,000 people live in Canton B. But 100,000 people also relax on the beach every year. The factory interferes with the beach, pollutes the pod, who decides on the construction? Well, here we have an obvious use of a certain shared resource. The river, it is not fundamentally different from the highway. But it has one
Но у
important
нее есть один
nuance.
важный
What we
нюанс.
dropped
То, что мы
upstream,
бросили
it will
выше
come
по
sooner
течению,
or later
оно
to those who are
приберется рано или
downstream.
поздно к тем, кто ниже по течению.
In other words,
То
they
есть
should have the right to
они
set some
должны иметь право
restrictions
какие-то
in
ограничения
terms of what can be
устанавливать
done with the
в
river
плане,
upstream
что
there.
там можно с рекой делать выше по течению.
In general,
В общем
I
случае,
think that
я
in
думаю,
terms of
что
environmental
в плане
protection,
защиты
the
окружающей
entire
среды
population there should
там
actively
все население
participate,
должно
even
активно
if it happens
участвовать, даже
somewhere
если дело
locally,
происходит где-то локально.
because local
Потому что
consequences
локальные
can very
последствия
quickly
могут
turn
очень
into a
быстро
global
превратиться
one.
в
But here
глобальные.
is a
Но
more
тут более
obvious case,
очевидный
that
случай.
is,
То
due
есть
to the
из-за
fact
того,
that
что
someone used the
кто-то
river upstream as they
использовал
wanted,
реку выше по
even wars
течению,
have
как ему
happened
хотелось,
repeatedly,
даже
very
войны
not
неоднократно
illusory.
случались, весьма неиллюзорные.
That is,
То есть
people
люди
build, for
строят, например,
example, a
плотины,
dam to
чтобы
irrigate the
поля
fields,
орошать, а
and
тем, кто
those who
ниже
live
живет,
below,
им даже
they don't
по
even have
сути
enough
воды
water
не
to drink.
хватает.
Well, like they're
Ну, типа
offended.
им обидно.
They
Вот.
are going
А
to
тут
war on
для
them,
них война.
trying to force them to give it up.
Пытаясь их
It is
заставить
better
от
to
этого
solve this in
отказаться.
advance,
Лучше
of
такое
course, by
заранее подписать
negotiations. And here
переговоры.
it's not
И
even
дело
about
даже не в
tourists and not about the
туристах и не в
population.
численности
If, on the
населения.
contrary,
Наоборот, вверх по
100,000 live
течению живет
upstream,
100 тысяч,
they live
а ниже
thousands,
живет
and
1000,
tourists
и
go to those who are
туристы
upstream.
ближе
It's
сверху
still
по
necessary
течению.
to ask
Все
those
равно
who are
тех, кто
downstream,
снизу по
even
течению,
though there
там
are fewer of
скорее
them.
будет меньше,
Well, the river
река
inevitably
под
flows next to
с
them.
неизбежностью рядом с ними протекает.
Do you want to make a
Хотите сделать
sewage
выше по
discharge
течению
upstream, but to
сброс
some
выше
kind of
него, ну,
drainage or
сделайте
treatment
какой-то
facilities,
отвод
so
или
that those who are
очистные
below do not
сооружения,
leak? Do
чтобы
not
тем, кто
float any
ниже, не
garbage that you dumped there.
не приплывала всякая фигня, которую вы там сбросили.
One more
В чем
question.
вопрос?
Strategic blindness of the
В принципе,
masses.
если
In the
пока
city,
нас в городе
60% of the
60%
population is
населения
elderly,
пожилые,
40% is
пожилые,
young. It is
40%
necessary to
молодые.
save
Необходимо
demographics,
создать
to build
демографию,
urgent
строить
infrastructure for the young,
инфраструктуру для молодых,
kindergartens,
детские сады,
nurseries,
ясли,
playgrounds,
детские
maternity
площадки,
hospitals.
дома.
By direct
Без
vote, the
голосования
majority of
большинство
60%
100%
decided to
решило
build
только
nursing
выйти
homes.
с аренды.
20 years
За
later,
20 лет
the city
город
died
вырос.
out. Most
Причем
definitely
точно
can't be
не будем
wrong.
ошибаться.
But in this
А в этом
example,
примере с
what
чего вы
makes you
взяли,
think
что
that this
эта
error
ошибка
was?
была?
Maybe they are,
Потому
as
что
it is
они,
called,
как
people
это
who
называется,
refuse
люди,
children.
которые
Their
отказываются от
philosophy is that
детей.
humanity
Их
should die
философия
out.
состоит в том, что человечество должно вымереть.
And so,
И вот
they
они
organized it
локально у
locally
себя
by
по
common
общему
consent
согласию
on a
на
voluntary
районных началах
basis.
это организовали.
In other
То
words,
есть
there
никакой
is no
гарантии нет,
guarantee
что
that,
им
even without
даже
such a
без
philosophy that they
такой
profess, even in this
философии,
case,
которая
there is no
исповедуется,
guarantee that they
даже в
need
этом
nursing
случае нет
homes less than
гарантии, что им дома
kindergartens,
престарелых
nurseries.
меньше нужны, чем детские
Maybe they
сады и
think to
ясли. Пусть
themselves
они там
that
для
we are
себя
already
думают, что
retired
мы
anyway.
все равно
We will babysit the
пенсионируем, будем
kids.
детишкам
Why do we
делать
need a
то, зачем
nursery
нам
and a
никогда
maternity
будет
hospital?
дана.
But when
А вот
someone
когда
is really
оказывается
tight,
совсем туго,
yes, it
да,
would be good
хорошо
if he
бы,
went
что
to a
он
nursing
нашел
home where they would
престарелых,
take care of
где
him,
за ним
give
будут
him
ухаживать,
medications,
там
painkillers
медикации
there.
давать, обезболивающие.
Also, here is an
Тоже вот
example.
пример, он
It rather
скорее
speaks
говорит
in
в
the opposite
противоположном
direction.
направлении.
This is not an
Это не
example
пример
of an
очевидный
obvious
ответ,
mistake, somehow justified.
самообоснованный.
This is an
Это
example of,
пример
well, one of the options,
одного из
yes,
вариантов,
so it may seem to
может
people that
показаться
it is
людям,
better.
что лучше.
Well, if
Ну
people,
и
their children
если
and
людей,
grandchildren are happy there to
есть
some
там
extent,
дети и
it is
внуки,
unlikely that the
фактически
majority will
радуют,
decide. But let's
вряд ли
not give them
большинство будет
anything.
решать, а давайте ничего им не дадим.
In other
То
words,
есть это
it is
возможно
possible with some kind of mega
мега-конфликт
conflict between these two groups.
групп.
Well,
Ну,
they will
что
decide
они
so.
так
They will
решат,
take
эти
this 40%
40%
and move
возьмут и
somewhere,
сделают
and there,
это. И
to
там
build themselves a
построить
nursery,
ясли,
schools,
школы,
whatever they
детские
want,
сады.
and those
А те
60%
60%
will somehow get out of it
сами
themselves.
выберут.
It is
Власть
impossible
может
to
выбрать
forcibly
себя
detain
никого,
anyone
если
if
ему
he does
нравится
not like the
правильно
rules
человек,
established in
если
some
ему нравится
area.
какое-то место.
And I like it so
Причем
much
не
that he
нравится
can't even
настолько,
eat,
что он аж
he can
кушать не
always
может,
take
но
and
всегда
move,
может взять
even
и
without
поесть.
selling the apartment.
Даже не продавая
Well,
квартиру.
yes,
Ну да,
at a loss,
допустим, но
but
всё
everything is
лучше,
better
чем
than
так.
that. Let's see if any questions have
Посмотрим,
appeared in the
какие
chat during
вопросы
this time.
появились за это время в чате.
Here,
Ну,
apparently,
видимо,
they
про
ask
вот
about the
правую
game
модель
model,
спрашивают, а
but try to
попробуйте
simulate these
моделировать
armies.
эти армии.
Well, they are trying to
Попробуем
model it. The whole
моделировать. Тут
question
есть
here
вопрос,
is to
насколько
what
наша
extent
модель
our game
рисовая
model reflects
отражает
what
то,
is
что
really
происходит
happening.
на
In
самом
other
деле.
words, NATO
У
in Russia, in
НАТО,
my opinion,
в России
does
пока
not.
нет, но
But
у
NATO,
НАТО и,
and in
в
particular,
частности, у
the American
американской
Army,
армии, у них
they
есть
have some kind of
симулятор.
simulators. And there
Там
is
вообще
generally a
традиция
tradition to hold
проводить
war games
военные
in the
игры
literal sense of the board,
виртуальные,
because this is
настольные,
a map
потому
of the
что
area. area, and their generals with a smart look move tanks, or an army group. It is very ancient, and there is still debate about which model best reflects reality. Models, it should be noted, are sometimes very sophisticated. Everything is more complicated there than it happens in computer games. Well, in such entertaining, but there are no guarantees. Modeling, of course, is useful and generally a good thing. I myself would like to make some kind of game in the future, on the example of which it will be possible to compare. Well, that is, usually in games, when we have implemented some kind of system, we still manage mostly. And this system just gives us some bonuses and disadvantages, and we really can't compare them. But there are games where the mechanics change a little bit from the decision made. Here is the very example of such a Victoria Paradoxkaya. Yes, I changed it there, I changed the way of voting, you have other results that have started to fall. This is modeled there with some degree of accuracy on such population groups that conditionally exist there. Well, somewhere else, there is a Crusader King stream, so you change the rules of inheritance there, your outcome changes. Some things have already been done, it can be checked. But the problem is that we have changed this business for Victoria. Our layouts have changed, but we still manage it. There is only one thing that begins to happen independently of us, but apart from the fact that other leaders and other parties are chosen, which impose some restrictions on us. But there are some conditional capitalists there, and under some economic policies, they can build factories themselves, and under some others, only a player can build them. And with some third parties, on the contrary, only capitalists can build, but the player cannot. Well, that's up to a certain degree of influence, but the problem is that he doesn't think much about it there. In other words, in order to check it, you need to make a good game. I don't mean strong, yes, so that he can talk about philosophy with us, but he should be able to play this game well, beat people there confidently, and we can check which option is better on him. In particular, she launches the case at high speed. We will check faster than if people were playing, and we checked this case with our experience. To what extent have we, humanity, come close to modeling groups of people and their behavior sufficiently so that it can be manipulated through extremely covert propaganda? In terms of propaganda in general, it is impossible to approach this at all, and in my opinion, well, because a person's brain is plastic, and after a while, he begins to resist all attempts to control it somehow. In other words, we have to come up with some new options, but in most cases, those in power in different countries are saved by the fact that nothing needs to be invented. This is not a matter of psychology, not in some more clever deception, but in the fact that, well, people may have no motivation. Or, on the contrary, there may be some kind of psychological fad. Well, there is identification of the ruler with the Father, with a capital letter O, or there is an announcement of him as a protege of God, and people there are ready to tolerate anything if only not to enter into some kind of conflict with him, not to disobey him. Well, or there is a variant of such psychology, which, by the way, is widespread everywhere, very abundant, almost everywhere, yes, but it's like, without suffering, it's not real, you have to overcome yourself every day. If you are having fun, then something is wrong. And then there is a decoding, you are not a real communist there, not a real Russian, or there is not a real person at all. That is, there is some kind of justification for why not only it is not necessary to fight suffering, but on the contrary, even this is good. There are the same religious justifications. And it's almost known. In other words, it does not require any mega research, mega modeling to be carried out. But as soon as this point of view changes, and for what reason we are changing, no one still knows. There are probably many of these reasons, possible options, but there is not even a list anywhere, and no one can name even individual ones. Well, when it changes, it does not work to counteract it with any psychological techniques. We take again the beginning of the 20th century in Russia, where everyone was blowing the same tune, and the church, and some high-ranking officials, and the royal family, and the press. Well, everyone said that no, don't touch anything there, we are all for the Tsar, for the motherland, for the faith. But it still didn't work out. Yes, at first, obligatory prayers were cancelled, for example, and the next day, no one came to them, well, almost no one. But what's the use, right? We campaigned for this, it seems, through the church. It turns out that the church no longer has authority. And that's how to resist it? In general, nothing. That is, some political scientist or perman will tell you that he is just a mega pro there, he understands everything there. He knows how to twist everyone around his finger, but usually either he is just lying, or he knows how to use the current situation.
умеет пользоваться сложившейся ситуацией.
In other words,
То есть
he
он
doesn't
ничего
change
особо
anything
не
much,
меняет,
he
он
just looks
просто
at how it is
смотрит, как
now
оно
and
осталось
implements what can be
стоять. И
implemented
в
within
рамках
this
этого
framework. In
реализует
other
то,
words,
что можно
this is not some
реализовать.
kind of cunning
То есть
plan,
это не какой-то
but in
хитрый
fact,
план.
you know that
Вы, по
Vasya
сути,
is ready to
знаете,
give
что
you
Вася
1,000
в этом
rubles just
случае
like that.
рублей
You
даст
come up
просто
and
так.
say,
Вы
Vasya,
подходите и
give me
говорите, Вася,
1,000
дай мне
rubles.
1000
He
рублей. И
gives.
он
Did
дает.
you
Вы
manipulate Mega
там
there
медленно
too?
не
No,
поехали.
oh,
Да
he
нет,
was
он и
so
так
ready to
был
do
готов
it.
это
You just
сделать. Вы
expressed a
просто
wish.
изъявили желание.
But it's hard to check.
Но проверить это
This
тяжело.
is my
Это
point
с
of
точки
view.
зрения
In my
инженера, на мой
opinion,
взгляд,
these
вот
people
эти
who consider
люди,
themselves
которые
mega
себя
per people,
мегапиарщиками
they're like,
считают,
well,
они
I don't
примерно
know.
как
Wine tasters who really
дегустаторы
can't
вина,
distinguish wines, but they
которые
get
реально
money and
не
fame
могут
because they
вина
pretend they
отличать,
can.
но им приносят деньги и славу, то, что они делают вид,
Well,
будто бы
here,
могут.
in my
Вот,
opinion,
по-моему,
the same
такая
situation.
ситуация.
Maybe
Может,
not,
не так,
but I
но
haven't met people
я
who
пока
could
не
convince me
встретил
yet.
людей, которые меня бы смогли переубедить.
And the statement that
А
yes,
заявление,
no,
что
I
да
can,
нет, я
or
умею,
yes,
или
I
да
can,
нет, вот
but
то,
it
то,
seems
не
unconvincing to
безумно,
me.
мне кажется.
Tell me, please,
Скажите,
is it possible in
пожалуйста,
principle
возможен
to
ли в
vote at
принципе
all
вариант
without the
голосования
influence
вообще
of at
без
least some
влияния какой-то
propaganda? No,
пропаганды?
it's impossible. The
Нет,
most important
невозможно.
thing
Самое главное,
is
что нам не
that we do
надо
not
этого
need to
добиваться.
achieve this. People know
Люди
how to
умеют
convince each other of
друг друга в
something.
чем-то
They
убеждать.
use
Они
logic,
пользуются
they
логикой,
invent
они
something.
что-то изобретают.
And it goes through
И
exactly
это
the same
идет
mechanism.
ровно тот же самый
I thought
механизм.
so.
Я
Someone
думал
gave
так,
me
мне
arguments.
кто-то
I
привел
changed my
аргументы, я
mind. It
придумал.
was also
Тоже была
propaganda, sort
пропаганда,
of.
вроде как.
Someone gave me
Вот
these
человек привел
arguments
эти
as part of an
аргументы
explicit act.
в рамках явного
He
акта.
wanted to bring
Он
them to
хотел
me.
мне их
Well,
привести.
or maybe he
Ну или,
brought
может
them
быть,
there
и
unaddressed,
безадресно
but still
приводил, но
wanted
всё равно
them to be
хотел, чтобы вы
recognized.
знали.
But my opinion
У
has
меня
changed.
мнение
I began to
поменялось,
vote
я стал
differently.
по-другому
Propaganda,
голосовать.
yes. Is it
Пропаганда, да,
necessary
надо
to
ли с
fight
ней
it?
бороться
No,
или
oh,
нет?
that's
Это
good.
хорошо.
The fact that
То, что
people
люди
are exchanging
выдвигают
arguments is a
аргументы,
good
это
thing.
хорошо.
It's bad when they are
Плохо, когда их
forced to vote
заставляют
somehow or are not
карты
allowed to vote
голосовать
at
или
all.
не дают
They are
голосовать
simply
вообще,
forced to
просто
perform.
заставляют
That's
исполнять.
bad.
Вот это плохо.
It's bad when
Плохо,
someone seizes
когда
a monopoly
кто-то
possession, a
захватывает в
tool,
своем
well,
монополе
for example, the
владение
media,
инструмент,
and only
ну,
he can
например,
use it.
средство массовой информации. И только он один может им
This is
пользоваться.
also
Это
bad,
тоже плохо.
but if
Но если
everyone
все
can use it
примерно в равной
approximately
степени могут
equally,
пользоваться,
and if they
и
want,
при желании
people can
друг
even
друга
unite in
объединиться
groups,
в
and
группы
thus
и
strengthen themselves,
как-то
right?
усилиться, да,
Well, it's a normal
ну, это
situation. What about the
ситуация,
bills?
как считается.
Otherwise,
Иначе
knowledge
знания
simply
просто
won't
будут
spread.
распространяться.
Red or but growth,
Читал
managing the
Лена
general,
Остром
the
«Управляя
evolution of
обществом,
institutions
владельцы
of collective
институций
activity.
коллективной деятельности».
No, oh, I
Не
haven't read it. I haven't even
Даже
heard the
название
name.
не слышал.
In reality, on the one
Реально,
hand,
с
it
одной
seems
стороны,
that few
кажется,
books
что
are
мало
published.
книжек в
On the
мире.
other hand,
С другой
it turns
стороны,
out
оказывается,
that there
что
are a
не
lot
так
of them
уж
published in the
много.
West. And if you start
Если
Googling,
начать
you can put
гуглить,
yourself
можно
there.
там ставить,
Well, make a
можно
list there
ставить
for 10
список
years.
на 10 лет.
I have it for
Я
10
не-
years already.
У меня
I
вот
don't have
так, у
time to
меня
read
10
them.
лет, я их не успеваю читать.
I squeeze something
Еще
into
только
it,
втискиваю.
sometimes ahead of schedule, to
Иногда
read it before
досрочно
retirement.
прочитать до пенсии.
But it is unclear in what order to cram.
Понятно, в каком порядке
We have to fly by
вписывать
instruments.
приговоров.
What is the real
Кто реально
population of
увеличит
Russia?
население
I
России?
don't know. Look at the demographer's estimates. Somewhere
Ну,
around
где-то
140 million. Sort of.
вроде бы.
But how do you know
Но
for sure?
как точно узнать?
There are different
Есть
calculation
разные методы
methods.
подсчёта,
Which one is
сколько
correct?
правильно
They are
это
known.
известно.
So, isn't it better to
Не
fight
лучше
in
ли
games
против
then?
них тогда воевать?
Definitely better.
Безусловно, лучше.
It was still in
Всё в
Schweik.
Швейке было.
Well, if
Ну,
there are
если
two
там два
kings who did
настоящих
not share
друга
something,
не
let them go out there
поделили,
and
люди
fight.
там подерутся.
The main thing
Главное,
is
что
that
у
we
нас
are not
компьютеры.
involved. About computer games.
Компьютерные игры.
About computer
Про
games,
компьютерные игры
let's also do a
давайте
stream on the
ещё
weekend,
сделаем на
well,
выходных.
like talking about
Стрим,
everything.
ну, типа разговора об
There is more
этом.
detail
Там
there,
детали.
because these programs are watched by
Эти
those who are
передачи
not very
смотрят
interested
те,
in some
кто
parallel
вообще
topics.
интересуется какими-то параллельными темами.
For them,
Для
this is
них
a
это
strong
всегда
on a
абсурд.
topic. So, the
Так,
questions in the
вопросы в
chat
чате
have ended
пока
for now,
кончились,
so they
поэтому
are again
снова
preset.
заранее заданные.
You say there will
Вы
be no
говорите,
executive
что
power,
исполнительной власти
but
не
how will
будет.
you
А как
force
вы
the
заставите
participants to
участников
use the
в
universal
принципе
voting
пользоваться
system in
всеобщей
principle?
системой голосования?
I haven't read it to the
До
end.
конца
I'll
дочитал,
just
просто
say right
просто
away
не
there's
было
no
никак.
way. This is
Это по
optional. A
желанию.
person wants
Хочет
uses,
хочет
does not
пользуется,
want
не
does not
хочет не
use.
пользуется.
This is a voluntary matter. This is to prohibit, yes. It needs some kind of force that will prohibit, well, prevent someone from prohibiting the use of this system. Or, they can be forcibly persuaded to vote somehow. Here it is, and there is no need to force. A group of people is interested in making an anti-people decision. When voting, he will inevitably be discriminated against and knows. But apparently this is some other group of people. Is the majority discriminated against when voting, knows about it, or has already been discriminated against? Oh no, it's that group after all. It's hard to read questions here that the author, in my opinion, did not read himself. But the desire to make this decision has not gone away. What will prevent this group of people from colluding and starting to break the system? Collusion won't hurt anything. And to start breaking the system, it depends on what they do. If they are campaigning, they're right. If they start to force and interfere, but, apparently, some kind of popular counterforce is needed. In any case, there will be something like a militia, their squads. Another thing is that she does not live with her own hierarchy, but somehow, well, in the style of such idealized sheriffs in the USA, who understand their, and must act with an eye to the opinion of the population, they will not want to, with the words "and then you cannot elect me." In other words, the important point here is that the voting system is permanent. I emphasize once again, yes, permanent. This means that we do not have a moment after which everything, the decision has been made. Nothing can be changed anymore. No, we have a moment after which we will start implementing it, and we will cause ourselves, someone else, temporary inconvenience, and spend some resources, but we can stop it at any time. And for this, you don't even need to start a new vote, you just need to rearrange your tick. As soon as the majority ceases to vote for this option, as it were, everything, he stopped. If there is a quota for some other option, it is implemented. And here there is any interception of the authorities, if they have not physically disconnected people from this system, but they have simply been fooled by some project, but at some point people will understand this and revote. This project will be stopped. Yes, resources have been spent, but what to do? Better late than never. And if they never cancelled it, so maybe they like it, how do we know? It may seem to us that this project is bad, but to others it seems that it is good. And here, something anti-national decision appears there. And who decides whether it is anti-national or not? The person, apparently, who is asking this question, he thinks that he has objective criteria by which he can say for sure. And in a direct democracy, there is no one who speaks for sure. We always find out this by the vote of this very people as a whole. One person, one vote, that is, in equal proportion. And here is the current version. This is the people's solution. If they did it by manipulation, well, they bribed a lot of people. They hid the fact of voting from the rest. But when the solution starts to be implemented, everyone will know about it, and at any moment, they will remove the checkboxes. Moreover, they can be removed even by those who have been bribed. There is no such law that if you are bribed, you are obliged to vote as you promised, right? It turns out that these people have a huge risk. That is, they will spend a lot of money, and this decision, it may be valid there for 2 days, and after that, they will also be taken away from them everything that they received in an anti-people way in quotes, on the basis of this decision. And this is a factor that stops people, much more than any dictator's will. You can negotiate with the dictator for a long time. If he changes his mind, you can kill him and replace him with your own person. And the whole population, how is it? What are you going to do with it? Will you continuously unfasten his money? And where is your benefit then? You will pay many orders of magnitude more than you will receive from this project. And if you stop paying, it will be cancelled immediately. Well, here's an example. Well, then there are some examples about these very cantons that appeared before. I have already answered them partially looking ahead. The principle is that you can still cancel this whole thing at any time. Among these options, there is one that they have abolished the direct voting system. That's what you should always hold on to. Even if you don't like the current decision, you should always remember that it's far from a fact that canceling a direct vote will do everything as you want. It is quite possible that they will accept, well, dictators, yes, or a salary group in other matters, or maybe even in this. They will make a decision that is not at all what you wanted, and you no longer have any ways to influence it, because you are no longer in this group. Who will monitor compliance with the mechanisms of public institutions in direct democracy. The answer is always the same. Everything is always monitored in terms of decision-making by everyone who can be affected by its results. In other words, in general, the entire population of a country, or even the world, depends on how much is already included in this system. To do this, they can create some kind of power structures, but these power structures do not have their own internal leadership in terms of decision-making. That is, they can make some small tactical decisions in quotation marks, well, roughly speaking, in what order to rearrange the legs there. They somehow decide for themselves, right? But from the outside, they have limitations. There are tasks that are set for them. If they don't like these tasks, they can quit. They don't have to do them. Well, unless there was some kind of, extreme contract. Well, like, if a medic, for example, works in some kind of ambulance, say, or in the rescue service, and now there is a victim, he is already on the spot. He cannot say at this moment, I will not treat them, I quit. That is, he has to finish treating them, and the next day he can quit. This is such an extreme contract, yes, but it's just a reinsurance, because there will be no time to look for a new one. It puts people's lives at risk in this way. But in most cases, we can't say, you're a medic or a policeman there, or someone else, that's it. You've been enslaved there for 25 years now. No, can a person quit? If you can't find employees according to your conditions, perhaps there is something wrong with the conditions, you need to adjust them. Perhaps you have created unbearable working conditions, or you have erred against the justice of all specialists in this field. Then you need to train new ones somehow, or to change something in their conditions, so that at least some of them are recruited for these vacancies. In other words, in any case, this is a negotiation process. There is no such thing that we magically decided everything without negotiations and talked in advance. In general, it seems to me that people imagine direct democracy, and sometimes the management of a dictator or a junta there, in exactly the same way. That is, everyone guessed it the first time, no one consulted with anyone, nothing was ever changed, there was no feedback. But, even with the most frostbitten junta, this does not happen. Their people do not guess right away, and somehow react to what is happening. But it's necessary to be absolutely stoned, to always insist on your own, no matter what happens. And in most cases, such people do not sit on the throne for a long time. And when they crash their own, not to mention the fact that there may just be popular unrest all over the country, rise up and throw them off along with the whole system. So, an example of two houses, conflict. But this is a question for the previous one, again about who will determine what. They are determined by voting at a larger, higher level. It always works. It doesn't make sense to ask about specific cases every time. So now, let's imagine that we have a state. There are 4 federal districts. 40 people live in one, 10 people live in the other, 15 live in the third, a quarter for 100. And under such conditions, there will always be, everything will always work in the interests of federal district number 4. Well, because they have more votes than all the others combined. And it really is. First of all, we have a certain imperfection of the model of direct democracy, which consists in the fact that we accept the option that was chosen by a majority of votes. And this is not quite correct, because we really need, well, let's say, the alignment was 70 to 30. 70% for one option, 30% for the other. In a very good way, we need to fulfill 70% of one option and 30% of the other. In most cases, this is even possible, but practice shows that even if one does not invent such a principle specifically, that 70% will be implemented. For statistical reasons, it turns out that the contract, but negotiations go on until the absolute majority is in favor of some option. Why? Because the smaller the gap, the more likely it is that we will change our mind and start implementing another option. Well, because there should be quite a few people. It was in the articles about direct democracy, right there with numbers and graphs. Yes, the smaller the gap, the fewer people need to change their mind in order for the option to change to some other one. And people in the experiment understand this very quickly, even if it is not obvious in advance. This is evident even at the level of microcollectives. 6 were for one option, 4 for the other. They rushed to implement the second option, for which there were 6. One changed his mind. That's it. There are already 50-50 of them. Well, or there for certainty. Let there be 9 people, and 5 for one, 4 for another. One changed his mind, that's it. Cancel, implement the other. In these cases, people try to agree almost to a full consensus, or there, to a conciliar decision. But it has to be an experience, right? That is, there are things where people will stand their ground against a minority on principle. But this is a case of allowing, well, I do not know, there, a sacrifice in the church of the city. It is clear here that they cannot be resolved by 70%. Here, the option seems to be more discreet or something. On there, let's, well, build parks everywhere. 60% were in favor, 40% were against. But the obvious option is let's set them up anyway, just less than we first suggested. Here, the priority option is possible, and there with sacrifices, but we will have to negotiate anyway when. We'll say, well, let's make you special places where you, without scaring everyone else, will cut your chickens there, and walk around with them in a circle there, sprinkling everything with blood. Maybe Zoe's defenders will be outraged, Figs knows, then it will be even harder to negotiate. But in most cases, it is possible. And here is the same situation, that is, 100 against 65 of these internships, someone may change their mind. This does not mean that everyone inside this district absolutely agrees with each other. And there, 30 people changed their minds, that's it, another group wins already. In other words, the risk remains for them anyway. Plus, they have a separation of powers. That is, they are the main ones in their own district, but in another district, even if 15 people live, but those are the main ones. And if they are completely pressed, they can even say, but we don't want to be in the same country anymore. Our district will be a separate state, and you can do whatever you want there, if you don't consult with us anyway. In other words, this freedom that many are so afraid of, it really increases the number of ways to negotiate, and ways to scare someone else, not to let him monopolize some resources or impose his opinion on everyone there. It's not just the dictator who can order, he can order there. An ordinary employee really, that is, a plumber comes to you, and you tell him, and I want the toilet to be repaired naked there. I am a client, my word is laws. Most of the employees, he will say, you know what, go fuck yourself. I'm going to sort of write down what you told me, and no plumber will ever come to you again with such visits. You're going to call strippers there, and teach them how to fix the toilet. Well, that is, here is the same situation. You will have to negotiate in any way, although it may not be obvious at first. Have you considered the issue of panic within the framework of direct democracy? A situation where everyone has to decide, but it is impossible to give information to everyone in full. That's not true. Information can always, almost always be given to everyone, and temporarily it can be held only in conditions. Well, roughly speaking, we are now trying to catch some bandits there who are stuck somewhere. If we inform everyone through the mass media that we are coming from such and such a side, the bandits will also find out. But there are very few such cases in the world when it's necessary right now, and for a very short time. That is, wow, it is permissible. But after that they have to report in all details, say why they stormed from this side, why they have such a decision. They should be authorized to act in such situations, that is, in advance, yes, that we give this group of people the right to act there for an hour under such conditions, without asking for a general opinion. But if they don't report back after that, or we don't like how they act, they won't work in this area anymore, according to our decision. It's exactly the same here. In most cases, we can give all the information. As for the panic, oddly enough, this, I say, is paradoxical. When I encountered it for the first time, I didn't believe it myself. Strangely enough,
Как ни
in
странно,
conditions of tight
условия
deadlines,
сжатых
people
сроков
of direct
люди
democracy make decisions
в
faster than in
результате
conditions
решения
of
принимают
indefinitely long deadlines.
быстрее, чем в условии неопределенно длинных сроков.
That is, when
То есть,
everyone
когда
understands that
все
there are
понимают, что
problems that
есть
need to
проблема,
be
которую
urgently
нам срочно
solved, it
решить,
can be accepted faster than
оно
if the
может
dictator
быть
accepted
быстрее
it.
принято, чем если бы его диктатор принимал.
There is a statistical
Там
reason for
почему
this,
есть
because when there are
статистическая,
30
потому что
people
когда 30
blowing, the
человек блоуют,
probability that at
вероятность
least
того, что
someone will
принято
come up with a
определенное новое
solution
решение,
is
она
higher than that
выше,
of any
чем
individual,
любого
however smart.
отдельного, сколь угодно умного.
Therefore,
И
yes,
поэтому таки
and
да,
people argue much
спорить
less in
люди
these
гораздо
conditions.
меньше в этих
Although
условиях.
I say,
Хотя,
it
говорю,
seems that,
кажется,
well,
что
we know
мы
there's a
знаем,
crowd,
толпа,
everyone
все
rushed there,
будут слить
trampled
кого-то,
someone,
толпу
but there is no
запаковали,
direct
но
democracy
в
in the
толпе
crowd.
нет прямой
That's the problem.
демократии. В этом
The
проблема.
crowd does not
Там
agree on its
договариваются
actions,
о своих
but it
действиях,
acts.
а она действует,
Well, as it
ну
were.
как бы,
Everyone inside it
каждый
acts on
внутри
their
нее
own.
действует по своему усмотрению.
That's the problem.
В этом проблема.
And all these
И вот эти
stampedes and so
судавки и
on,
так
they
далее,
wouldn't
они
have
бы не
happened if
происходили,
people had
если
voted.
люди
But like,
проголосовали.
yes,
Ну типа, да,
bullshit,
фигня,
here
вот
we
мы в
are in the
толпе,
crowd,
дождь
it's
пошел,
raining, let's get our cell
давайте
phones out now,
сейчас
log
мы
into the
вместе
system, and
достанем,
agree on
запустим
how to
систему
leave.
и договоримся, как
Well, yes,
выходить.
we'll
Ну
get a
да,
little
чуть-чуть
wet, but
промокнем,
at
но
least
зато
no
никто
one
не
will die.
умрет.
When people have a
Когда
habit
у
of
людей к
this,
этому
it is
привычка
done
есть,
automatically
она
at
на
all.
автомате
That
всё
is,
делается, то
people
есть
will not
люди
shy
не
away
будут
from
шарить
side to
с той
side.
стороны в
Well,
сторону, ну
or
или
they will,
крупным,
but a small
маленьким
part of them or all of
усилием.
them. This is just
Это
typical
как раз
behavior, well,
типичное
like kids who have
поведение,
escaped
ну
from the
как бы
control of their
детишек,
parents.
которые вырвались из-под контроля родителей.
That is, if
То
a
есть если
child
у
has a
ребенка
long-standing
есть
habit
привычка
of
давно,
deciding for
вот
himself,
он сам
being
решает,
responsible
сам
for
несет
himself, he
ответственность,
acts much more
он действует
carefully
гораздо
than the
более
one who was
адекватно,
taken
чем
care of from
тот,
morning to night
кому
for all
кажется,
previous
что
years,
он еще
and
в
was not
состоянии
allowed to
взять
decide
инициативу
anything at the moment
и
when he
давать
suddenly drew
что-то решить.
freedom.
В тот момент, когда у него вдруг нарисовалась
Here's a type of
свобода. Вот
parent
типа
turned
родитель
away. I'm
отвернулся,
here
я сейчас
now,
тут, я
I
не
don't
знаю,
know.
моторы
I'll set
подожгу,
the curtains
порядки
on fire
установлю.
as an experiment. It's
То
just
есть
those
это
who
как
have
раз
no
у тех, у
habits,
кого
and
привычки
those who are
нет,
used to
и
living
те,
under
кто любит
authoritarianism, they act like
авторитаризмом
this.
жить, они вот так действуют.
I thought you
То есть
said
ты
you were a
вроде говорил, что
mathematician by
образованием
education.
являешься
Do you think it
математиком.
makes
Как
sense to
думаешь,
get a
имеет ли
mathematical
смысл получать
education if
математическое
you are engaged
образование,
in
если
programming
занимаешься
and not quite
программированием,
math
причем не
areas?
совсем мат-областями?
Despite the fact that it
Наверное,
is in the
немножко
topic,
off-topic,
but it
но
still
оно к
applies to modeling,
матпрограммированию
so I
все-таки
will
относится,
answer.
поэтому я отвечу.
In programming,
В
mathematics will
программировании
never be useful
математика
to
вам
you
не
at all.
пригодится вообще никогда.
That is, if
То
you
есть
are going
если
to
вы будете
program something from the
программировать
field of
чего-то из
mathematics,
области
this is where you will
математики,
need
вот
this
тут вам эта
area.
область
But it will
понадобится.
also
Но
be with
также будет
absolutely
в
any
любой
area.
области.
That is, if
То
you
есть если
program a
вы
sewing
будете
machine,
программировать
you will
швейную
inevitably
машину,
have
то
to
вам
figure out how
сразу
sewing works in general.
разобраться, как вообще шитье
And
устроено.
programmers
Не
really, they
программисты,
always
реально, они
understand the
всегда
subject
разбираются в
area to which
предметной
the
области, к
programs
которой
belong,
относится
not
программа.
at the level of
Не
a
на
mega
уровне
guru, but at
мега-гуру,
the
но
level
на
at least
уровне,
of a beginner
по
already well.
крайней мере, хорошо так уже начинающего.
Well, that is so
То есть
confident,
такого
and
уровня.
often they
А
surpass the average
зачастую
people.
они середнячков
Well,
превосходят, ну,
because
потому
training in
что
teaching yourself new
тренировка
areas
в
is also
обучении
training,
себя новым
and it's just
областям — это
easier
тоже
for a
тренировка,
person to do
тренировка
it.
проще это
When I
делать.
like the person
Когда я
repeated,
брал человека
it is easier for him
ему
to enter
каждую
each
новую
new
область
area,
проще
not
входить
even
не
because
потому,
she
что
is
даже
connected
что
with
она
others,
связана с
which is
другими,
true,
это правда
many
так,
areas are
напрямую
connected,
связано.
but also
Но
because
еще и
she has
потому, что
no
у нее там
psychological
психологических
barriers there,
барьеров
he
нет,
already
у нее
has a
есть
habit of
привычка
searching for
свойственная
information,
информации,
ordering, and so
исследованию
on.
и так далее.
So, there is no
Вот
point in
специально
specifically
заморачиваться
bothering with
математикой
mathematics,
нет
because
никакого смысла, потому
programming,
что
well, conditionally
программирование,
there are some areas that can be
ну,
called
условно,
mathematics,
какие-то
but
области
this
могут называть
mathematics was right in
математикой,
its infancy
но
before the
эта
advent of
математика до
programming.
появления программирования была прям совсем в зачаточном состоянии.
And really,
И
real
реально
mathematics is already
настоящая
directly the field
математика
of
уже
programming.
вот непосредственно область
And there
программирования.
were some
А там
beginnings,
были
but the
какие-то
clues, the first
начала,
considerations,
зацепки, первые соображения.
and the other areas
А
will not be
остальные
useful
области
to
вам не
you. I mean,
пригодятся.
well, you just won't meet
Ну,
it.
вам просто это не встретится.
If you are
А если
programming
вы
websites,
сайты
integration there
программируете,
will
то
not
вам
help you in
эта
any
интеграция
way,
никак
or
не
there is a
поможет
tiver.
подтянуть тебя вверх.
But if you
Вот
start
если вы
programming a
начнете
system to analyze, say,
программировать
site
систему
traffic
для
and find
анализа
ways to
пляжной
increase it,
посещаемости
then yes,
сайтов и
you need a
поиска
tiver here.
способов, как ее повысить, тут да, тут вам
But
тягар
this is the
нужен.
same
Но это
subject
опять же
area area as any other. You might as well assume that you will be programming a drawing program and start learning to draw there in advance. Or to study music there, because what if you are going to program something related to music? But in itself, in terms of mate, modeling is less useful. Some areas, yes, not all, but some of them are really useful. In particular, the turver is a very necessary thing. Almost certainly. If you are going to do something related to Turver, you will need the concept of a limit. You will need the concept of integrals. The differential equation is already in question. That is, the matin is partially included, but partially, and not entirely. Any such exotic areas of mathematics they're like topology, well, they won't be useful to you in Turver at all. In programming itself, none of this is useful at all. The second part of the answer is about mathematical education in general. The whole question is, how are you going to get it? If you are going to go to university for this, in my opinion, this is not a very effective way. In other words, I studied at FIS Tech, a good university, strong of course, but I was not interested. As a result, well, I probably learned something in these 5 years from the field of mathematics, but the real is small. Then, when I became interested in mathematics again, I had a period when I was interested in school, then university, is such a gap. Well, how many years after it? And then it became interesting again. Well, I almost completely figured it out, even with the fact that I did not understand at the university. It took me, but I do not know, 3 months. Another thing is that materials are hard to find. I first tried how it is accepted at the university. Well, like, we take a textbook, we start reading, and the textbook is like this, from those recommended for universities. And it's just unbearable. Even forcing yourself to read is hard. It is necessary to look for either a book where the author expounds in normal language, or even study it on the example of some articles, fragmentary videos, and collect a complete picture from this. And that's pretty easy. That is, you are unlikely to deduce it all yourself from scratch, but the habit of filling in the gaps and diagnosing the gaps, that something is missing here, it develops very quickly. If you just try to deal with different areas, you will then. On the contrary, it will seem that I don't understand how people cannot notice that there is a gap. Well, that is, it's just obvious. As there is a square drawn on one side of the screen, and on the other, there is a void between them. If a person tells me I don't see where there is emptiness, I will look at it with great surprise. It's the same in the sciences. Well, that is, here it is, well, here it is, obviously there is. And this method of traditional education type, it is generally outdated. In mathematics, this may not be as bad as in some other fields, but it's also bad. And, well, I was really bored at the university. In other words, they seem to give me all this for free, but I don't even want to take it. Well, because it's just unbearable, and most importantly, it's cut off from everything at all. That is, they tell it, I do not know where to apply it, they do not give any examples. Well, that is, some kind of stupid activity that might have worked if I already had a specific task, and the course would have fallen exactly on it. And that's questionable, because I would have figured out the articles and videos faster. Therefore, it makes sense to learn this, but not in a university way, but more so modern, more free or something. Well, that is to try, experiment, read some fragments, opinions of different people, and in this process, a person begins to understand the meaning, and not just memorize some texts, spells, theorems, formulas. He understands what it is about, how the logic of this phenomenon is built, yes, how his model can be built. I believe that the consideration of how to formalize this in a single form of texts, diagrams, all the developments in the arrangement of the society of the future was precisely considered. This stream cycle has been consecrated to this, but to have everything on the shelves in one place, in hypertexts and schemes, is planned for the foreseeable future. Well, you know, it is planned, but I understand that no one will read it. That is, she will crash a lot of forces, but it will be very poorly demanded. Because people, they are ready to sort out articles or videos like this. And there is usually no need to read the reference book and learn it by heart. That is, the rubricator, yes, it's probably great. Sequential images, but if I perceive it as entertainment for myself personally, I will do it. And why not? It amuses me. If they don't overdo laziness there. Well, on the one hand, there is an interest that pushes me there, but on the other hand, I'm too lazy to do it, because there is a lot of effort. That is, maybe that's how I'll do it, but as a reference it doesn't make sense. Reference books everything. The age of reference books is numbered. By inertia, a person thinks that it would be more convenient. Well, no, it's more inconvenient. At best, a manual. Well, that is, there are topics with answers to questions. If you have a question about how to do this, then this is it. In order to be able to give links to a person from the outside, he would not need to dig around. On the one hand, yes, it is convenient when there are such links, and I myself often ask people for them on some other topics. But the problem is that despite the fact that I ask people for them, I often do not use them myself. And I suspect that this is the case with most, because, well, I haven't seen people who have read all my materials, which already exist. This is not yet a thick book, not 1,000 volumes, but still there are no those who have even looked at this in a semi-entertaining form. And you think that if I write a detailed book, much more complex ones will appear, then surely not. That's why it's such a kind of entertainment. It rather stems from internal perfectionism, and not from any practical need. So, he said about the panic. How will the benefits of direct democracy manifest themselves? When making decisions concerning processes that are greatly stretched over time, the result of which is not obvious right now. This is most of the processes like this, as it manifests itself. Yes, as it is now. Do you think that now someone is thinking through all the steps for 30 years ahead? Oh no. Even with the most ideal formations of the best cases, people have a concept, and they start poking around there at random. And the ideal system is only in the sense that they more or less regularly try to poke, and not once for a report, and then throw. That is, well, a person's head doesn't work like that at all. Your situation is always such that you will not be able to follow any plan in detail. It makes sense for everyone to have plans in advance, but there is an hourly, well, a layout by the hour to do, well, it's generally useless. But again, here we take the same programming. It is useful to have approximately a list of steps. Yes, £100 is useful. It is useful, well, to describe the concept at least with some accuracy. Well, yes, it's also useful, because if you don't have a project, you won't be able to start doing it. In other words, you still have a phase of experiments. Is it useful to paint everything right on the clock for 4 years ahead? Yes and no. Why will you throw it out in a month? And throw it out for the second reason. When you start implementing something, a lot of things become much more clear to you than a joke with a long preliminary consideration. And therefore, all your plans that somehow the previous step relied on them, well, the next step relied on the previous one. They will go to waste as soon as you begin to diverge at the very first steps. Well, you will take 10 steps, but the 11th, 12th have already dispersed, and the next 100, they are already different. In other words, you just spent time describing something that almost certainly won't happen. And it doesn't make sense to expect that some kind of magical system will act in a different way. She won't act like that. That is, we will have to fly by instruments. Here is an example about this. For example, your favorite topic of education. The correctness or incorrectness of the education system will become apparent to people conditionally 10 years after its introduction. But judging by the comments, most people right now think that Soviet education is the most correct. And that's the thing. That is, if these people start thinking in advance, well, here's how we would do it. They have projects and assessments. They are not at all the same as they will be after a person starts trying this thing. That is, they somehow got out of school, didn't really remember anything, and they don't even need it. But they argue in general terms, but it would be nice for our children to do something there, well, like do for us, what we could not do at the time. And it would be nice if all the specialists were there for something. Well, that's right, I'm not an expert, let them suffer there. It seems to them that they understand everything correctly, but things like my criticism, yes, of the current education system, they are based on the fact that I was faced with the results. What kind of university I studied? Well, yes, it seemed to me that it was boring, but I thought that I was so lazy. In fact, this system is good. And then some years later, I realized that it was impossible to work with a lot of people. Why? But because they have these points coming out of the education system. That is, they are like employees, they are right here. It would be better if they didn't have any at all than this. At least I didn't have to retrain. Yes, they were a blank slate. Well, or a person has some false knowledge. Again, it is better that he thinks that he does not know, and would look in the directory or ask someone, than to think that he thinks that he knows, does not ask anyone, and as a result, is done completely wrong, relying on some incorrect or outdated or erroneous facts from the very beginning. And here, it is not to make a guess that someone comes up with in advance. Someone will come up with a concept in advance based on the experience they have already gained, and that's exactly how they appear. In other words, my approximate ideas about how the education system should be arranged, it is based on my experience, because I have tried many times to learn different things. In general, in total, I've been doing this well, somewhere around 30 years at least, and maybe even longer, right? And I looked at which methods worked on my example, and on the example of some other people, and which did not work. And that's what I'm building a concept out of. Let's focus on these methods that worked for the majority, and others that are preserved as a ritual. We will throw them out, because their effectiveness is at best undefined, and at worst it's just very low, and we know about it.
В лучшем случае не определена, а в худшем случае просто очень низкая, и мы про это знаем.
Therefore, this concept arises based on people's experience. They try to change something in that direction. Yes, they can't help but guess, but it's also bad to leave it as it is. In any case, the system will act like this. The whole question is how many options we will have, even if the entire population can make decisions. But people can organize a bunch of options locally. I think that this option is correct, and we will set up these experiments in this way without violating ethics, right? Because this wish of people was made, and not forcibly, yes. Some of them will work, some will not work. We will have experimental data. We will have people with experience in various fields. We will be able to clarify. We will be able to select the options that are better. And if someone thought in advance, and swore there on the Bible, that it would work great like this, but well, how did he not guess? Yes, he will assert, and every time in such cases it happens that they assert. I'm a despecialist, I understand megaturbo, just listen to me. But there is no guarantee. The fact that a person says to himself that he is an expert does not mean that he is an expert at all, because a lot of people will say that about themselves, and about the fact that they know the correct version, the majority will say in most cases. Any current version of it seems to be correct to the carrier, and it takes a long time to wean yourself, so that it does not seem so. To realize that here I have too little data is at best a likely hypothesis, and not a wrong version at all. Tactical troops, almost at all times, acted according to how they were trained. The command only reports these fragmentary signals. This is to the question of talking about military tactics. Well, I've already said about this there, that this drill, it really took place only in a very narrow range, temporal and geographical. That is, most of the time, oddly enough, drill training did not make any sense at all. Because with modern weapons, we will not have to go anywhere in formation. On the contrary, it is harmful. We always have to go to the loose, right? We are building. It can be convenient to walk along a good stone road. But in most cases, if we go to build, we will simply smash this road into trash. That is, for Roman roads, which were actually recruited from stones, we are building a norm. They even seem to be trampled, aligned. If we try to march on the asphalt with someone else with horseshoes on our shoes, but it's worse than a tank will pass over it. There really are 100,000 people there who will smash him to dust just in one pass, and not to mention they're in 10. But on a concrete field, probably, yes, they are normal. But, are there many concrete fields in the world, and how often you have to walk on them? Well, the same thing is there. The tactics themselves are completely different. It made sense at the time. Why? Well, there's a wall of shields, for example. It makes sense, it does. But an archer, for example, who shoot from a horse or in a loose one just, well, on foot right. It doesn't make sense for them to line up. They become an easier target that way. There, linear tactics with guns made sense, as long as these guns were muskets, that is, smooth-bore weapons, which have a scatter of bullets there, I do not know, 30 degrees there, and even if you really want to, you will not hit a person, no matter how much you are trained to aim, but you just do not know which way the bullet will fly out. And so we build. We won. Why? Well, because their 200 people could shoot at the same time, and just created such a density of pulses, at least someone would get hit. The flip side of this is that when others are standing in formation, they will be hit more often. Well, they would also fall into the scattering. They can be attacked there with bayonets. Well, in general, a lot of these nuances. As soon as the rifles became rifled, that's it. The formation begins to come to naught. They are no longer fighting. And the drill in some cases obeys exactly the same laws. There was just some kind of turning point at which many things were fixed. Well, like it's accepted. It's accepted in the army or there, I do not know. It's accepted in the language. The language was changing all the time, yes, but at some point, people came up with the idea of making dictionaries and made the language much more fixed. The same thing happened there. In other words, we have introduced statutes that are mandatory for execution and have begun to extend a fair part of things that are no longer needed in theory, just mechanically into the future. Well, that's where we went to build. It's beautiful. Let's teach everyone to walk and build now. They taught them to act there. Well, they don't think to follow commands. Let's do it now. And now, in some cases, it's bad when a person doesn't think, because the commander may not take something into account, give a moronic command, while the soldier can see the situation much better. And the concept is changing, yes, especially in the most progressive armies. They sometimes teach you not to follow orders, yes, if you doubt that the commander is sane, or that he even understands what is happening. Do not follow the order. Our statutes, as far as I remember, may have changed now, but 20 years ago it was like that. That is, you, even if the order is completely moronic, you carry it out, and then write a report with a complaint. Here in many armies they say, no, you don't have to do that. Why? Because then you are an accomplice. Just don't do it. In other words, this maxim, the fact that it is being repeated now for some historical reasons, does not mean that it is true. And no, a trained army will not always win. That is, if now some natives with shields and copies come out in formation to the modern, for example, American army, it will simply crush them into dust. Now, if they scattered out along it, how the partisans would act, they would still have at least some chances there. But there is no formation, they will just kill them all. And sometimes, once it was the other way around, that is, the British, due to the fact that they were able to get into formation and possessed oblique and crooked but still firearms, they could take out the superior forces of the attackers in all directions. But this is not a universal thing, it depends on technology. I do not agree about the fairy tales about the discrepancy of short-term and long-term interests. For example, to tell neighbors to put energy saving, it has already been, only in a more detailed form. The idea pays off in 10 years. If you are told that something will pay off there for, roughly speaking, the entire lifespan, it's probably a hoax. That is a normal thing. It pays off for the foreseeable future, and with energy-saving light bulbs exactly the same. When they tell you that we will finally benefit from them after 30 years, this thing is not profitable. Why? Because over the next 5 years, there will be light bulbs on which we will benefit them for a year. This means that we will lose the previous 4 years or 5 years there, and as a result, this money is never commented on to us. With energy-saving light bulbs, this happened. That is, they obviously began to pay off in a year, and sometimes faster, and without taking into account energy consumption. Purely on the prices of the bulbs themselves, simply because they need to be changed much less often, and before that it did not work. And it is quite logical that it did not work, because it was a new technology that was not justified expensive, and only rich people could afford it for reasons that it is pleasant for me to feel like such an original, a progressive. Yes, I have the means for this. One more question. There was a speech about the management of enterprises. It was said that people are quite capable of planning the management of an enterprise, not just for the moment, but also with a view to the future. I have already talked about this several times today, but nevertheless the question is, if they can still understand that they need to leave something for business development and not eat it all at once, will they be able to understand and accept how justified such a multiple of the boss's salary is, and how to justify this multiplicity in principle? Nothing, because in general, it is not justified. I do it just because I can do it. I can give noodles to employees and hire management, and thus extort a very large salary for myself. In reality, it is not justified. But it's exactly like this there, 10 times higher than the salaries of everyone else. Is there 3 times it can be justified? Well, some very rare employee there, and therefore he can dictate his terms. And the salary of the boss is no, it is not justified. And responsibility, as I have also said in other programs, as a rule, they do not bear. Ordinary employees have more responsibility in practice because they have fewer opportunities to return from it. Well, the bosses of the times they also fall under the distribution, but these cases are much less common than the cases when they blame it on the employees. What about solutions that have a deadline, when everyone has to decide before a certain point in time? For example, the purchase of equipment. After the purchase it will not be possible to vote. Well, first of all, it will work. We bought it, now we can sell it. We have a warranty period there, when we can hand it over, even without losing it. Well, or we will pass with losses. Well, what to do? Well, you didn't guess. We will have a problem, only if no one needs this equipment in principle, and we screwed up so badly. Well, in general, the deadline, yes, it increases the tension. As a result, as I also told you earlier today, people make decisions even faster under deadline conditions than without it. It will be the same here. That is, when people realize that the money spent will be returned only partially, they will be more attentive. Why? Because it's their money. This is not an official who distributes the budget, but this is their common money. Everyone will lose a little bit on this. The official loses almost nothing on this, and often, by the way, he even wins very badly on this. In other words, his optimization methods are not at all the same as those of people who decide about something related to their lives. Let's say we have a settlement somewhere in Yakutia. From the category of only airplanes you can fly, there are no planes, it is not economically profitable. Residents of Severodvinsk, well, this very locality though. At least a normal road along the winter road. But the nearest other city is 800 kilometers away from them, and of course there are no resources of their own to maintain a winter road of such length. Well, like, what to do, yes, in such a situation. What are you going to do about it? If your locality is needed by others, or you convince them to take care of you, well, okay, you will be allocated money. Well, no one cancels crowdsourcing, and no one cancels donations. That is, you can always simplify. And often, by the way, it works very well even now. Then it will work even better. Now my friends and acquaintances are making a system of such mutual revenue. Practically, well, as if conditionally unaddressed, right? Well, there are amendments. It is necessary to make a separate transfer with them, so that they tell everything in detail, yes. But it's possible there. Well, perhaps with one condition, that these residents will then help someone else who is in the same situation. Otherwise, they will not see help a second time. And here, for example, is an option. But again, It's your
Но,
opinion that this
опять же,
locality should
ваше
exist at all.
мнение, что этот населенный пункт вообще должен существовать.
Or perhaps it
А
exists
возможно,
solely
он
for
существует
entertainment
исключительно
or
для
for some religious
развлечения
reasons
исключительно
of those
религиозных
who still
мотивов
live in
тех,
it.
кто в нем все еще
That
живет.
is, maybe
Почему
nobody
никому не
objectively
сильно и
needs it,
никому не
and in
нужно.
fact, you
И,
are
по
asking
сути,
for
вы
money.
просите
Well,
деньги,
they could
вы
have
то же
asked for the
самое
same
могли
thing,
попросить.
but I want to go to
Просите, я
Greenland,
хочу в
but it's
Гренландию.
expensive.
Но это
Lets you
дорого.
collect the money for
Давайте вы
me.
мне соберете деньги.
But it's not the same that
Но
you
это
are
не то же
terminally
самое,
ill
что
there
вы
with
сильно
something.
смертельно
This is a
больны.
different
Это
situation.
другая
You want to have
ситуация.
fun like
Подходите
this.
вот так
But if
поразвлечься.
someone is
Но
interested
если
in your trip to
кому-то
Greenland, or
интересны
someone
ваши
is interested in
поездки
you as a
в
person, so he is
Гренландию,
ready to
или
give you money
кому-то
for
вы
this fad,
интересны
but
как
okay.
человек,
But if there were
и
no
он
such
готов
interested parties,
бзик
but look for them
ваши
yourself,
выделить
or
вам
do not
деньги,
go to
но
Greenland.
если таких заинтересованных не нашлось, ну, ищите сами или не езжайте в Гренландию.
Leave this locality for
Уезжайте
some
из
other
этого
one.
населенного пункта в какой-то другой.
For housing in another
Живя в
locality,
другом
you are more
населенном
likely
пункте,
to
вам
be
скорее
collected,
собирать
quite
деньги,
possibly, for
возможно,
moving.
и на переезд.
If a person believes that changing the
Все
decision is
считают, что
evil,
смена
for
решения
example,
зло,
an
например,
extra waste of
начинает
money
каждый
on
день
renaming
думать
streets,
основанию
what should he do?
убежать.
Well,
Ну,
in most cases,
в большинстве
those who do not
случаев
like something
тем,
do
кому
not
не
need to offer
нравится
to implement
что-то,
it.
не надо предлагать это
That
реализовывать.
is, it is
То
enough
есть
that they
достаточно,
simply do
чтобы
not
вы просто
interfere.
не мешали.
If this is a project
Если
that
это
requires
проект,
some
который
costs,
требует
there is
каких-то
a system
затрат,
attached to this
там
case,
к этому
which I
делу
wanted to talk
прилагается
about in a
система,
series of
которая
videos
все
about the
рассказывает
economy.
в серии видео
But
про
I'll
экономику.
tell you
Но
about it
расскажу
here.
про нее здесь.
2 videos came out, if anyone doesn't know, even 2.5. There was also a video with additional transcripts, but it hasn't come to that yet.
Но там до этого еще
But I will
достаточно
briefly
давно.
therefore say, not in
Я вкратце,
detail,
поэтому
but in
скажу
brief.
подробно,
The
вкратце.
system works like
Система
this.
работает
Roughly
так.
speaking, each person has a
Грубо
share
говоря,
in the total
у каждого
taxes,
человека
which he
есть
personally
доля
manages.
в совокупных налогах, которые распоряжается лично он.
How to make sure that he doesn't give them
Как
Siberia
делать
to
это
his
с
friends?
семьей и друзьями,
This is a
это
long separate
отдельный
question,
вопрос,
right?
длинный,
Let's
да,
assume
предположим,
that
что
there is an
ответ на этот
answer to
вопрос
this
есть.
question. And now it seems to a
И
person
вот
that it is not necessary to
человеку
rename the
кажется,
streets,
что не
so
надо
let him not
переименовывать
spend his
улицы,
money on it.
пусть он на это свою сумму не
Let the
тратит.
one who seems to
Пусть
need
на
it
это тратит
spend
тот,
on it.
кому кажется, что надо.
That is, if a
То есть,
person
если
agrees with
человек
the renaming,
согласен с
but does not want to
переименованием,
spend money on
он
it, that's the way
тратит на
out.
это деньги, вот выход.
If someone just
Если
wants to
просто
rename
кто-то
streets,
хочет
and
переименовать
someone doesn't like it,
улицы,
it will become
а ему не
inconvenient.
нравится, что станет
But it is
неудобно,
not more
но он
important.
не главный.
Yes, it is
Главное
always
всегда
possible in our
ваши
electronic
коды
era, in
электронные.
any reference books,
Любой
to list all the
справочник
previous names,
перечислять
to
все
search by address,
предыдущие
and
названия
search, even without
этих
additional
вкладов.
clarifications, that I need the old version of the name.
Искать даже без дополнительных уточнений, что мне нужен старый вариант
That is,
названия.
you dial it
Если вы
and that's it.
выбираете,
The
и
street
всё
was
видите
found.
на
If you
штате.
want,
Но если
it is
хотите,
even
там
signed on
даже
an electronic
написано на
card,
электронной
it will
карте,
be the name that you like.
название, которое вам нравится.
Up to the point that you can
Вплоть
wear
до того, что
augmented
на
reality
фактически
glasses
дополненной
and even see it on
реальности даже
signs.
на вывесках
But if it really bothers you at
ничего
all,
совсем вас как бы
then
не
now,
пугает.
this
То есть сейчас
problem
эта
is much
проблема
weaker than
гораздо
it once
слабее
was,
стоит,
when
чем
it was
когда-то.
necessary to
Когда
reissue
надо было в
everything in paper
бумажном
form.
виде всё это
There is no
делать.
need to do this
Электронно этого
electronically.
делать не
We
надо.
just added
Вы
another
базу
field in the
данных просто
database
ещё
in 3
одну
seconds,
добавили,
and that's it.
занесли.
The issue is
Всё,
resolved.
вопрос решен.
Those who like the
Тем,
old,
кому
use
нравится
the old.
прежнее, пользуются
Those who like the
прежним,
new,
тем, кому
use the
нравится
new.
новое, пользуются новым.
And a lot of issues, by the
И тут
way,
вопрос в
are
том,
also
как
being
это
resolved.
делать.
But there is always
Но
an
всегда
option
есть
not to spend
вариант
your share of the
свою
budget
деньги
on
взять
it.
на это не тратить.
This is a kind of
Это будет
reconciliation.
как бы примирение.
How should the voices of the
Как
deceased,
следует
who
читать
have changed their
голоса
place of
бывших
residence,
и
be
нынешних
counted out
жителей,
immediately?
сразу вычеркивать?
This is a good question,
Это хороший
but it doesn't
вопрос,
have an
не
explicit
имеет
answer. In the
явного
first,
ответа.
well,
В
such
первом
as it
нет
were,
такого
absolutely
ответа,
justified. As a
абсолютно
first
обоснованного.
approximation,
В
in
первом
fact,
приближении,
as soon
на
as he
самом
is
деле,
eliminated,
только
we
выбор
immediately
будет
cross
сразу
him out.
вычеркивать.
In most
В тех
cases,
случаях,
this is the
когда
most
крайне
correct
необходимо.
option. There are
Есть
cases when this is not
случаи,
very
когда это
healthy,
очень
but they are
здорово,
mainly
но
related
просто
to
они в
cultural
основном
heritage.
связаны с культурным
In other
наследием.
words,
То
they
есть
do not
большинство
concern
данных
most
вопросов
everyday
они не
issues.
касаются.
Well, there, roughly
Ну,
speaking,
там,
there
грубо
was a
говоря,
person who
был
invested a lot
член,
of effort there to
который
make,
вложил
well,
кучу
some kind of
сил там
statue,
в то, чтобы
yes.
сделать
And just to take his voice and
статую,
delete
да,
it
и
doesn't
его
seem to be
голос
very
просто
cool.
взять и вычеркнуть вроде бы не очень здорово.
It has to be taken into
Его
account
как-то надо
somehow,
учитывать,
but in
но в
most
большинстве
cases, the
случаев
deceased
им
does not
всё
care.
равно.
It's more of a tribute of some
Скорее,
kind.
это дань уважения какая-то.
So, now we
Так,
are looking
сейчас
at some
смотрим,
more
что какие
questions
вопросы
appeared in the
появились.
chat. What is the meaning of life for
Чате, в
Poleks
чем
Kretsky?
смысл жизни по Алексу
And he's not.
А я
Have
вам
fun, satisfy
получаете
your interest.
удовольствие, удовлетворяйте свой интерес.
That's the meaning of
Вот
life.
смысл жизни.
Why they are asked, I do not understand. You. Then I will answer you. Your eyes will open to the world. If the voting is smeared, the questions are smeared, there is one cancer everywhere. Why do we need traditional voting at all then? I do not know. Did I say that it is necessary? When I go outside and help Grandma cross the road, isn't that an act? But definitely an act. And on most issues, however, it is not necessary to vote. It is necessary to vote, Virgo, you will coordinate your actions with someone. It is clear that we must strive for maximum autonomy. If a person does not interfere with anyone with his actions, let him do what he wants, as he wants. Isn't this the act of asking the question, I'm ready to vote, in one bottle? Well, definitely an act, yes. The formulation of the question is me. That's what I'm suggesting. I suggest that Grandma cross the road, and this is Granny's consent to the vote. From you, even on this principle, the relationship is already like this. Decisions are made by those who are affected by the result, and only they. If you do not create problems on the road, you do not interfere with pedestrians or cars there, and you are not going to celebrate it there. By breaking the nearest traffic light, the results concern only you. And here it is entirely in principle, in direct democracy, that the two of you decide this issue. And this should be the default with most questions. There are questions about what people do at home, only those who live at home. They do not concern the others, but in a bunch of other things as well. So, the questions from the chat temporarily ended. I'll give you about 15 more minutes. I don't care about anything, but listen, I'll even have time to answer all the preset ones. So I will answer, there are not enough of them left. And then we'll finish it until the next time. Maybe this weekend I'll just do a stream. There has already been one, but it's like about everything and nothing at all. There you can ask questions about the meaning of life. This is a series of questions left. Now it seems to me that I look a little differently at the problem of decision-making in areas with prevailing misconceptions. I'll make a reservation right away. The fact that someone believes that there is a misconception somewhere out there does not mean that he is right, but others are mistaken. Nor does it say the opposite. That is, a person who alone found a mistake, he may be right, and 1,000 who resigned themselves to the previous option may be wrong. But it may be the other way around. In other words, the fact that it seems to you that this is a delusion is not a guarantee. This may take a very long time to justify, and not everyone will accept it right away. So, then continue. There are areas in which there are not exactly delusions, but not obvious negative consequences of decision-making. Again, how do you know if they are not obvious? How do you know that your option is correct? Here's an example. It is possible to change the exchange rate of the ruble to the dollar, so that it is twice cheaper to buy in foreign online stores than it is now. Well, yes, you can. And will you agree to change dollars so much from abroad? You get them from there, sort of. You don't know how to print them yourself, do you? In other words, there is already something that limits you. About the harm brought. Many people do not immediately think about the harm caused to domestic producers, and it may be too late. Well, the question is also, and for what purpose do we support them? In other words, there is this trend mercantilism conditionally called, right? When it is said that we don't care, we leave free competition for our producers, only between our producers, and we will cut off external ones. In a milder form, this is protectionism, when we help our own and hinder others. Why? Well, these are their own. The fact that it seems to you that this will hit manufacturers, and that's how bad it is. Again, this is not a guarantee that it's really bad, and that's the way it is. And in a lot of cases, on the contrary, it's good to hit them like that. For example, when they use outdated technologies. Why? Well, because they will never transfer to new ones if you pay them for nothing. Most of them have the only motivation for the transition, and this is interest. But you support them. People with an interest there may not be in this area for a long time already, but roughly speaking. So we decided to ban all other languages in order to support domestic programmers who can only speak Pascal and Fortran. So I'm not going to be a programmer at the same time, you know. I'm going to try to go to another place where I can program in other languages, right? Or I'll do it underground somehow. But in any case, I'm not going to do this stuff. In other words, only those who came there will remain there, because they pay money there, and you cannot strain yourself. Well, nothing new to learn. For me, again, this is not a strain. Well, I know that it bothers some people. For me, this is a new kind of entertainment to study. Actually, that's why I don't want to write in old languages, right? But they don't like it. You seem to have protected them, but you have another long-term option. 50 years pass, and the whole world is already writing programs 1,000 times faster than you write them. And you have to protect them more and more and even more, because they can no longer compete with anyone. And what's the next step? In other words, the whole world uses modern software, and you offer them to continue working on the software of the 80s, well, to protect their own manufacturers. In other words, it is not at all obvious that this is a decision on protection. It is such as the person here gives in the example. That is, it is quite possible that, on the contrary, another option is better, and it was adopted by a majority of votes. At the same time, in some cases, people understand that we will have a lot of unemployed people. Yes, a lot of people will suffer. They will make some efforts to help them. Anyway, right? Well, in some countries there are all sorts of employment services, and there are unemployment benefits. A lot more, yes. In some countries there is even something similar to the Soviet compulsory employment. That is, when a person will be searched until the last, offered a job. Somewhere this limited time is happening, right? Well, after that, it is considered that the person, apparently, does not go to work on purpose. And somewhere there is not. That is, he will be offered as much as he wants, for as long as he wants. But here is such help for you. In other words, it may be necessary to abandon such technologies. And maybe it is necessary to set such a course so that foreign buyers buy. Thus, for example, it is faster to make a technological leap. The Soviet Union, which is praised so much, is praised by many, yes, for such self-sufficiency and self-sufficiency. In reality, he made his leap with great regard for foreign technologies and with great support from foreign specialists. Well, it didn't seem to people then that it was a trap. And then they started saying that this is what we are going to the West with a handout. But, at the time of the industrialization of norms, due to this, it was possible to implement it so quickly. With any political will, with the best organization, without such feeding in the conditions of such a lag, this would not have happened. It turned out there, and yes, the case is almost unprecedented. Ahead, so to speak, of the vast majority of everyone who has ever made industrialization. China, by the way, repeated, at a speed well later than the Soviet Union, there with a delay of 50 years, but in exactly the same way it did, with the help of foreign technologies, by sending people to study at foreign universities. Although it's hard to suspect anyone but the Chinese of a lack of desire to protect their own. But it was advantageous to do so. It seems that there is enough material in the articles to assess the learning rate of the team for the areas of delusions. But I'm not sure, here's thinking. Well, you can read a third of the article about it there. One of them is laid out in parts. Almost one part is entirely about the speed of decision-making. This is easy to say about an area with prevailing misconceptions. It seems that it is even possible to invent anything about what to do if we work in such an area. Well, how can such an area be detected in practice? No way. This is what you think is a delusion. It may not be a delusion. Conversely, what you are sure of may be a delusion. Therefore, the person writes correctly further, I suspect that there is no way, because this requires a reference expert who is not mistaken. That's right, and there are no such people in reality. And the right person writes, which can only exist in imagination. But then he develops this topic. Here I have two views. Now this topic is being ruled by the knowledgeable. No, it's not. Those who declared themselves knowledgeable rule, on average. Sometimes they are really knowledgeable, and in some cases they are not. And sometimes they know the truth, but it was true 30 years ago. That is, according to the 30-year-old level, they are knowledgeable, but according to the current one, they are generally suckers. It is better to take school children in their place, and it will be more useful. In the same favorite area, which I constantly give an example of programming, this was the difference between state institutions. Some of them had a proud name, like there is no automation, computer science, cybernetics, and some other ticks. No one knows how to program, but at the same time, people write articles, talk about something there with a smart look. No one can write a real program. I only know languages that, I don't know, have been used there for 50 years. No one has used them for the last 30. But really, they are talking about Pascal there, they are drawing some flowcharts. In general, who needs to draw flowcharts? Not a class diagram, but a flowchart. That is, here is a cycle to draw in the form of some rhombuses and arrows, despite the fact that people do not explicitly use cycles anymore. You see, it's not and. They declare themselves experts in this field. They have diplomas, scientific degrees, teaching positions. They also teach somewhere else. That's how they would steer. In fact, a novice programmer, he can replace an entire institute. It's not even a figure of speech. Do you understand? That is, they really have such a low level there that one more or less intelligent novice programmer turned out to be faster in terms of his work speed than their research institute weighs. And he understood the topic even better, dealt with them faster. That is no, those who know do not rule. This is a delusion that is caused by the habit of bowing to authority. It's not your fault. Yes, it's been developed in all Russians since childhood. Therefore, it's hard to get rid of this obsession. It's not your fault, but you have to try, yes, to get out from under this obsession. So, knowledgeable, proven people are steering. If you transfer control to the whole team, then there is a chance that they will learn more slowly. On the contrary, here I say, in practice the opposite is true. We should always take interested parties. And the expert is everything. He has received some positions. Someone will continue. As there was a wonderful person there, in my opinion, the surname Nikolsky. I can already be mistaken. He lived to be 106 or 108 years old, and all the while, he continued to do something mathematics. But there are very few of them. Most of the people I've met, they graduated at 30, and then they go here on what they remembered once. That is no. Interest is a much more important thing than any previously acquired knowledge. If a person has stopped, now he will become obsolete very quickly. 5 to 10 years is all. He is not really needed. If he hasn't made up for lost time over the years, he will be useless. And you trust them in vain. That is, in some cases, it is really better to ask the first person on the street. Then he is more likely to guess the correct option than the person who is sure that he knows the right one, but he knows the wrong one. He will not guess the correct one at all. He will name the one that he remembered, and he is already wrong. The long-term team will win. Oddly enough, in the short term, he will also win in most cases. That is, in very special conditions, when you are so lucky that there are no sensible people in the team at all, and the one you randomly chose, well, as by chance, according to some criteria that seemed logical to you. But this is a random process anyway. You can't guarantee it, right? So he turned out to be a mega genius and made a breakthrough in this area, and the rest are stupid, not interested. Here it is, but you can't identify this situation in general. You don't know that the situation you are in right now is exactly like that. And you just hope for it. Yes, that's how you reassured yourself. Well, my God, you reassure yourself that the team guesses correctly. There is a big mathematical basis under this. If you just need peace of mind, well, here it is. Consider that people are not fools. They will figure it out in general, right? I want to understand how the system will behave at the very beginning of the implementation process. But people will get used to it. That is, it will not work instantly, but it will work quite quickly. That is, in most cases, it will work well, almost from the very start. It's just that in the future, it will work even better when people get used to it. But, almost at the earliest stages, maybe even at the earliest stages, it will already surpass almost any dictatorship. It's just that she still has a lot to grow up, and it will be even steeper in the future. The question has not been disclosed, but this is practically the last one. There's something else asked in the chat. I'll answer it too. The last of the predefined ones. What to do in cases when we work in an area that constitutes a state official secret. I have talked about this in previous broadcasts. State secrets are almost always a fraud, in any state. Yes, this is the concealment of information about their own, despite the fact that others. Concealment. Now, you justify hiding from your own people by saying that some strangers can find out. But strangers in these cases, as a rule, already know everything. And this is just such a way to hide something from our own people, and hide behind it that we are being reinsured. In most cases it is. There is instant information, and I said this today, it happens that instant information needs to be hidden for a short period of time. But there are very few such cases, and after that, in 100% of cases, detailed reports and complete declassification should always be required. Dates, intelligence, strategy, planning. You can't hide it all in a bag. They find out about everything, but it's another matter that it's hard to find evidence. Everyone there knew that the US military could start shooting at civilians. By mistake, or even out of malice, sometimes out of nationalistic motives. Everyone knew that. It was hard to uncover, well, as if to steal, and put the evidence on public display. And there's all sorts of Assanges, Snowdens, they were doing it. That is, what they found was not a secret. They provided evidence for this, translating it from the realm of assumptions, well, or some kind of implicit knowledge. Yes, they're through conversations, into the realm of his proofs known to everyone. But at the same time, a lot of these things a spy were known to all intelligence agencies, and at times they threw it in. It's just a good trump card, let's hold it. He is not good for the people of the country. He is good for those in power in this particular country. In other words, we first, well, using the example of the same Americans, yes, we first. Since this is being done for our benefit, we will allow some Islamist terrorists to come to power there. But we are already preparing compromising material on them. In other words, if anything happens, we will start blackmailing them. Does the American people need this? No, damn it, it's bad for the American people, because they spend a lot of money on this stuff, and that the American people will get heroin in exchange, for which they will be put in prison. Well, it is beneficial for businessmen, big capital, and politicians. One is to be re-elected and pretend that the situation there is difficult. It's a war. It's not the time to change horses at the ferry. And also to stay there for a longer period. Or those who I do not know, cover the heroin trade, for example, or just do some kind of business. In other words, he bombed oil rigs very well, and then he took and built them out of the blue, got earnings. The same paid for their construction, and the army bombed the Americans' taxes. Convenient, excellent business scheme. And yes, it's all wrapped up in state secrets, because if people begin to realize the scale of what is happening, they will say it's fucked up. None of them can even be allowed to the municipal government, let alone the federal one, right? Well, it begins, and terrorism is all around. Let's turn off all the mass media there in general, and start listening to phones. Again, I'm not talking about Russia now, but about the USA. But it does the same in Russia, and it does the same in any country in the world. And for people, as a rule, it is harmful. On the other hand, well, this is a continuation of this question. It's almost over, just a lot of thoughts are suggested right away. On the other hand, we lose here, precisely at the moment when state secrets become public domain. Yes, and this is also true, because before that, someone of yours screwed up, and after you hid it and it surfaced after some years. Not only did someone of yours screw up, but you bastards were in cahoots with him. She was deceived by everyone, both strangers and her own. You deceived everyone, you hid it, and therefore, there was some benefit in it, right? Because if someone just screwed up, go prove that it was profitable for me. And here, it is already obvious practically. You wouldn't hide it if it wasn't profitable for you. And exactly the same reputation of the country can fall in this. But the government will definitely fall. Maybe countries too. If she constantly manifests herself in this way, sooner or later, the impression will be formed, these are incompetent. It's like negotiating with ISIS with them. They will not fulfill their promises. They're fanatics, they don't care about anyone but themselves. So yes, a perfectly correct person writes. At this point, we lost badly. Intuitively, it seems that just in such places, a limited circle of decision-makers is needed, and this will be a guarantee of abuse. But just like with the weights of votes, as soon as you allow someone to have a monopoly on information and declare something a state secretary, the power immediately moves to them. Because, well, if extreme measures are possible during the war, you will have a war continuously, because it is beneficial for someone to introduce these measures, right? Well, how was it in Rome during the war? Meant dictators, and every second strove to remain them after the war. For what? Either he started a civil war, or he delayed it, or simply tried to carry out a military coup. But like, how much did we gain from this? And not really, we are Romans. It's exactly the same situation here. They said there may be a state secret. Everything is unprofitable for you, and it will become a state secret. That's just it. And then, the person writes correctly, but the jetty order will grow in this place. On exactly so. It is guaranteed to grow, so this cannot be done. Only in short moments of time, with a mandatory report. That was the end of the pre-asked questions. I will answer the last questions that were spilled for the chat and finish today's meeting with this. Yes, that's a good question. We vote for Lex to release a video a week. Likes, votes for. No, you vote in rubles, that's a great way. For this, what is there? Subscribe, donates there, all that. Well, actually, yes, I myself may want to release more often, but on the one hand it's hard to get together, on the other hand, some programs and topics are just very complicated. Here is the one I told you about today. Probably this is the case when I was preparing for the longest time. Really, I wrote down this case. I didn't like the way I tell it at all. I rewrote everything, changed my mind, and built the story in a different order. In other words, it was not even possible on the first attempt. It also needs to be programmed. It also needs to be programmed so that not only I can read it, yes, but in the future people who have only learned these terms today should read it. That is, it's not such a figgy occupation at all. That is such, I don't know, probably a month of preparation. So here, vote with donations, such things. But I certainly want to release more often anyway. What to do? There are not always forces, and it is not always possible to prepare quickly. So it's almost over. They wrote a little more, I'll add, yes, there. About the meaning of life, that's all we'll skip. The thing is that the Rams have a request for a shepherd. Everyone needs a good shepherd. This is for anyone you know. That is, with the habit of loving shepherds, it can be hard to give it up, but some are lucky. They do not like shepherds from the very beginning. I, for example, have not liked all this since childhood. It was easier for me, just lucky. In other words, it's not that I was mega struggling with myself, and I didn't even have to fight with myself for this, I was lucky. Well, not everyone was lucky, alas, what to do? So that's it, the last few questions. People are asking. I don't know, I'll open it now.
Сейчас открою.
Ah, but then one
Ну
question
тут
was received on Danish on the lecture,
наверное,
but
один
it's like a
вопрос
topic
поступил,
about
это
Gödel's
два
theorem.
выклепик,
There are
но
5 errors, and
тема
says,
Gödeля
let
там
me
такие
tell you about it
решения.
separately.
Давайте я про это отдельно
In
расскажу.
other words,
То
I
есть
agree that
я
sooner or
согласен,
later
что рано
it is
или поздно
necessary to tell
надо
him more, but not now,
подробнее
but in
рассказать,
other
но
places.
не
I will
сейчас.
then see what he should do.
А в других местах я потом посмотрю, что там идет.
People write, when
Люди
donates
пишут,
vote,
что
the principle
голосование
of one person,
возвращается
one vote
один
is not
человек,
violated.
один голос.
All right.
Хорошо.
So, this is almost the last
Вопрос
question.
уже
Let's
практически
imagine
последний.
that there was a direct
Представим, что
democracy in
Южный
South
Кореец
Korea.
считал
In
Пеканки
conditions of
демократией.
general low
Южный
literacy,
Кореец
could Korean
должен
society
был
make the
принять
same decisions as
такие же
Pakonki?
решения, как Пак Чон Хи.
Listen, but I'm not an expert on North and South Korea, but I nevertheless read quite a lot from such a person nicknamed McCavity, who is an expert, and even talked to him about it several times.
Который специалист, и даже сколько-то раз с ним по этому поводу
Not very long, but
не очень
nevertheless.
долго, но тем
I
не
got the
менее.
impression.
У меня
I then
сложилось
read a little bit
впечатление,
of
потому
other
что
sources
специально
on
чуть
purpose too.
читал других
I got the
источников
impression
тоже.
that
У
it was
меня
like two
сложилось
boots in a
впечатление,
pair.
что это как бы два сапога
And to
пара.
think that South Korea
Думать,
has
что
made
Южная
some
Корея
extraordinarily cool
действует
decisions
экстраординарно
is the
клёво
same as
очень
thinking
сильно.
about North
Это то
Korea
же
like
самое,
that,
что так думать про Северную Корею.
and vice versa.
И наоборот.
That is, that there are
То есть
absolutely
что там
totalitarian,
сложились
well, almost
тоталитарные,
misanthropic
совершенно
regimes that have developed
близкие
there,
человеку
just under different slogans.
режимы, просто под разными
In some they
лозунгами.
blessed them,
В одних
praised the
они
market,
благословляют
in others they praised
хвалили
socialism,
рынок,
but in
в других
practice,
они
this led to
хвалили
the fact that
социализм,
society
но на
exists in a
практике это
dictatorship.
приводило к тому, что общество существует в условиях диктатуры.
And would the population have made
И
the same
такие же
decisions?
решения бы приняло
But if it would
население,
take this for a while,
но если
because
приняло
people
бы, то
don't like it when they are put in
ненадолго,
prison for their
людям
connection with
нравится,
relatives.
когда их за связь с родственниками в тюрьму сажают.
What to do in both Koreas,
Что делать
and not just in the
в Северной
north,
Корее,
as
не
some might
только
think,
северной, как
right?
некоторые могут
What
подумать,
kind of
да?
people's
Что
suspicions that
людей
exist purely on someone's
заподозрения,
words, well,
которые
are based
чисто на
purely on
чьих-то
someone's
словах
words.
существуют, ну, базируются на чисто на чьих-то
For
словах.
suspicions of cooperation with this
Заподозрения в
hostile second part,
сотрудничестве с
he
вот
can be
возрождением
imprisoned for
второй
20 years,
частью,
or
его
even shot
могут посадить
altogether.
лет на 20, а то
And
и
so it was
30.
done in both
Так делали
Koreas.
в обеих Кореях.
I'm not sure people like
Я
it.
не верю,
That
что
is,
людям
while
это
it seems
нравится.
that
То
yes,
есть пока
it's some kind
кажется,
of
что
enemies
да,
that
это
we are
каких-то
being caught,
врагов
it's
там
okay,
обходят, ничего
that's what he
страшного,
needs,
так ему
the
надо,
reptile
видимо, что
spies,
нам
a
делать.
saboteur. But with a good
Но
scope, it
при
begins to affect
хорошем
almost
размахе
everyone.
начинает касаться
Everyone in the
практически
family has a
у
victim.
каждого в семье появляется пострадавший.
This is unlikely to
Это
appeal to
вряд ли
most.
понравится
And
большинству.
people in general quite quickly come up
Люди
with the
вообще довольно
idea
быстро
that it is better that we do not
додумываются
put
до
some guilty
идеи,
people
что
in
лучше
jail
мы
than we
сколько-то
put 10 or
виновных
100
не
times more
посадим,
innocent
чем
people.
посадим в 10 или в 100 раз больше невиновных.
Therefore, they would not
Поэтому
implement
такую
such a thing.
штуку они бы не стали внедрять.
People say that there were American grandmothers there, but they write this in the comments. Yes, and there were American grandmothers, but I say, do not think that there was a free market society. Freedom of liberalism and prosperity there. No way, it was a totalitarian regime, and that's why they are starting to move away from it. They haven't completely moved away yet. That is, according to reviews, there is the same trash as. I do not know. In Saudi Arabia, if not in North Korea, for example, here in Saudi Arabia, it was like that and is also just beginning to take place. Or there in Iran, well, in Iran maybe even weaker. In other words, this is not a paradise mode at all. Yes, some people are great there, but you can even watch Korean movies. There now people are cutting the truth in full and showing in the best traditions of Soviet cinema, maybe even better than the best traditions of Soviet cinema, that society is divided, everyone is available to some, nothing to others, some live in palaces, and others live in basements.
Что общество разделено, одним доступно все, другим ничего. Одни живут во дворцах, а другие живут в подвалах.
At the same time, the second ones work mainly. The first ones, well, at best, work the same amount. Sometimes they work almost at all, but live better. In other words, it's not a fact that this is a very cool solution. The fact that there are some cool firms there does not mean that there is a paradise there. Cool firms, they were in Hitler's Germany, which actually made engineering discoveries something else. But this does not mean that they had a wonderful system there. No, it's just that, even with the most lame system, some scientists, they will be able to do something, yes. Some directors will be able to shoot something, at least some writers will be able to write something. But some of them will sit down or be shot, that's bad, yes. But it won't happen that we have zero. You see, even I am sure that in Cambodia, where they really tried to exterminate the intelligentsia, even there they probably scratched. And at this time at least someone came up with something good. Something is not a fig indicator. There were those who fled to North Korea from South Korea. Really? Yes, they ran in both directions. This is amazing, not everyone knows, because they prefer to move to the other side, not to pro. But they also ran there. And for ideological reasons, well, because there's the right system, we need to go there. But sometimes also for financial reasons, that is, they will give at least some work there, even if I won't starve to death. Well, they also fled to Japan, to China, to Russia, oddly enough, some people fled to Vietnam, to Singapore. It's harder to go to Singapore, to Malaysia. Well, that is, in general, there is very extensive in the USA. Well, you can enumerate a lot, but the outflow was not bad. And if you count all of them, it is even likely to be more than from North Korea, but in North Korea, they fought against it more strongly. So this is not a very good indicator, but most likely, if we stupidly take it head-on, it will be like this. Well, okay, let's leave it at that. Especially since it's already gone to the topic anyway. Where do they live? I will summarize, yes, that there are some examples that seem cool, and about which I want to ask, would they have implemented this in a direct democracy? In general, for a number of such examples, the answer will be not implemented. This is good, not bad. This should be borne in mind. Well, in general, thank you all. See you again. I hope that I can make a new stream at least, which does not require preparation, relatively quickly. And the next one, unfortunately, we have to build models there again and show this thing with graphs. However, such detailed explanations are no longer needed. It will be simpler there in this regard, and it will be easier to understand it, because there is a pure mat, the model, and the relatively simple logical explanations behind it. But this topic, yes, it was difficult today. In my opinion, the most difficult of what I have already told. So that's it, goodbye. Once again, it was nice not to see anyone, but to tell everyone this. See you soon.